Hey, what is going on, everyone? It is David Palmer, the Leo King, and Dr. Ann Wolke here for History in the Stars on High Vibe TV. We are covering tonight, because usually we do before dawn, but Dylan is away somewhere in Europe. You know, with Dylan, he's doing his magi stuff somewhere out there, but it's great to have Dr. Ann Wolke back and to bring History in the Stars with another awesome episode. It's been about a year.
I think it has been. And hello, and thank you for having me back.
Yeah, no, I'm super excited to have you back because I think the last episode we did was Edgar Allan Poe. Mm-hmm. But we did do a special event this year already about 2022. And,
right, yep.
You know, some really interesting stuff has kind of actually been happening from all that history.
Yeah, it's been a wild year.
It's been a really wild year.
Historical connections. So.
Well, and I feel that, you know, tonight's episode about looking at, you know, anytime we see a monarch secession, a transition, my main question for you, Anne, would be, is there a pattern, or are there maybe certain times that you feel in history that there's been where we've seen the monarch change that change the world, or it feels like there's a lot of world events that seem in history to kind of connect with monarch shifts?
I think historically there always have been. And I think what's unique about now is it's a very peaceful transfer of monarchical power. We all sort of wondered, is she going to skip over Charles and go to William or not? And that didn't happen. Charles is king. That's about as big of a worry that we have nowadays. But I think this is overall a very interesting time, full of all kinds of shifts. And I kept thinking about Queen Elizabeth I, and the transition after her reign, and comparing that to this one, because that's the last time we had, or they had, a very long reigning monarch who was a woman being succeeded by a male monarch. And we did a show about James I. So, I mean, we've talked about him before, but that was an era that was a really big shift as well, because that brought together England and Scotland officially under one crown, and ended a lot of struggles and started this new era, a newer era that had already begun, in which England was really going to rise, or Britain would rise as this global power.
I think it's also interesting that this past Queen Elizabeth II that we just had just passed away in Scotland. Mm-hmm. And that did change the way in which, you know, they had their Operation London Bridge, that was about how the 10 days of mourning would happen and the transfer of her body. Mm-hmm. But because it happened in Scotland, it kind of changed things up. And so it was interesting to see how, you know, she did die in Scotland, and to bring her all the way and then bring her on a train back. And it is kind of a weird paradigm if you connect those two monarchs with the same last name, the same first name, and that you were just describing how it was this whole shift of how does Scotland and England come together, and then how ironic there is this moment now where in Parliament, even pre-pandemic, there was the Scottish who have been not really happy with the way that things are, and there's been questions on whether they stay or not stay again.
Right.
It's kind of interesting to see that they did everything, from what I've seen at least, in her last 10 days of mourning and the whole funeral processions and ceremonies, being very much trying to show them unified together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I almost wondered as well whether, you know, everybody knew she was nearing the end of her life, and she went up to, I just was searching, was it Holyrood Palace where her body was brought there? She was at Balmoral.
Yes. And she was staying there a lot.
Right. So to me, it seems as if that was planned, right? That she would.
I agree.
She loved that place. She loved the house, and she enjoyed being there as a child. So I would assume she'd want to go to her favorite place as she's departing this life. But what I found so historically fascinating was that she was brought to Holyrood Palace. When she left Balmoral, there was a day where they brought her body to lay in state at that Scottish palace. And I had just been working on preparing some historical information about Mary, Queen of Scots, and that palace is so connected to that very interesting and tumultuous history. That was a very tumultuous time under Queen Elizabeth I, having to deal with Mary, Queen of Scots. A lot of people are familiar with that whole story. So
Right.
it's really interesting that she was brought there first for the first part of the public mourning.
Yeah, and I think when we kind of look at history maybe as monarchs, it's interesting to see that Elizabeth II comes in after World War II. Enough time has passed too from it to where she has been around as the longest monarch ever.
Right.
And it is really weird because, I mean, if you look at, I think what was her reign? It started in 1952. And it went here, and she just, she had her jubilee, correct? And it was like a 70-year jubilee.
Yes.
So the last 7 years of life has been a wild ride, but it almost is very weird where the world doesn't know where it's going, and she passes. And just, if you look at her funeral that just finished, in the last 3 days that have transpired have been events that individually in history, whether it's the Cold War or whether it's, I mean, the fact that the UN, they're speaking, the General Assembly's back after the pandemic. You have Russia, you have Russia, threatening nuclear stuff. You have all these things are happening as this new monarch has come in, and it's almost kind of like the stories are like they're cleaning up England right now from the ceremonies. But
Right.
there's all these other major events happening.
Yeah.
And they all feel very tied in to the switch over.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know a lot about the theories people might have about what's happening behind the scenes, right? But
And I'm not coming from kind of a conspiratorial place. I'm just coming from like as an astrologer, I just look at common denominators of what's happening in life, whether it's to the planets, and then when I look at it in our current moment, it's just like these one after another events have been like dominoes, whether it's the Ukraine and Russia war and how involved Britain is, and Britain put their whole military on high alert and told all their military soldiers to tell their families to prepare to go to war under Elizabeth. But it's also interesting that world wars have been with kings in power, not queens, in our last 20th century, right? So,
I'm thinking back to, there was a lot during Queen Elizabeth
Of course.
I, but yeah.
But it's interesting that, during our modern times, let's say, it's a king that's in. And also the fact that if she was in power for 70 years, most people that are living on the planet today have never witnessed or experienced life to see a monarch shift from England, at least.
The whole thing is so interesting because we're also seeing so much of the process of the shift happening, so much more than people would have seen when she became queen, right? That we're seeing not only the pageantry and ritual, and although I think that they still keep certain elements of it private. They don't broadcast every last thing that's happening. We are seeing so much more. And also now another part of the ceremony is the public mourning. And we see so much of people experiencing the grief. That to me, we were talking about this earlier, that to me brought home what the British monarch means to people for whom she was the queen, right? That there are so many people who feel as if they're mourning a family member, and then for it to happen right after the pandemic, and then to see the video of her actually saying that speech she gave during the whole pandemic, where she said, we're all missing family members, and they're playing that now about about people grieving her passing. It's just a spectacle beyond all spectacles. But the other thing is that it's amazing how we're seeing it everywhere, right? That even in the United States, it was, I walked into a restaurant the day, maybe 3 days after she died, and the CNN was on, and they were still playing just everything to do with the Queen. So it's fascinating. That's been the big news even for us.
And I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because if you think about World War II and it finishing in 45, and then when she finally comes into power, years following it, would be the first time that America and England had a better relationship since the Revolutionary War. I mean, they had decent relationships, but it really was World War II and creating the Allies and actually really working together against a terrible war, that we see this alliance kind of reform in a stronger way, that we would start seeing in the media and the press. Like, there's enough time in the history from the Revolutionary War that it's kind of like accepted more. Whereas if you were to, I guess, in the 1850s, start sending pamphlets out about the Queen or the King, if back then, they would just be like, "What is this doing here? Get this out of here!" Right?
Yeah, probably then.
I mean, there was the War of 1812, so that's why I'm thinking of.
Queen Victoria was very influential here as well. And if you even think about the fact that we'll say Victorian architecture or the Victorian era, and everybody knows we're talking about Queen Victoria. And I've always thought that was funny, because that was at the time when Britain was over most of the world it was the British Empire, but we were separate, right? We were the ones that weren't part of all of that.
Right.
And we still have always been fascinated with, it's almost like we're fascinated with the feminine monarchs, right?
Yeah, so and that's kind of an interesting point too. It is the feminine monarchs that, I guess, get a little bit more of a hall pass.
Some of them. I was actually going to say, it seems like the women, the queens, come in at a time when there's a lot of healing needed. Because when Elizabeth came in 1952, it's the post-war period. Britain is still reconstructing from World War II. It was bleak there, right? It was not a great time to be British. And so for there to be a coronation and her wedding also was very exciting for people, to have a break finally, to see something new coming out of wartime. So her presence right off the bat was very healing for people. And I don't think Victoria has the same sort of image. In fact, she kind of was queen over a lot of troubling times in British history, especially when we think about Ireland and the treatment of the Irish and the immigration that led to so many Irish migrating to America.
Right.
And then, but Elizabeth I was that same type of monarch. Mary I was not. We were talking about Mary earlier. Bloody Mary didn't have that image. So it's a very similar role that Elizabeth I played in England earlier.
Yeah, down the middle, neutral,
trying to bring
people together. Really was not too spoken loudly either. Really didn't pick too many sides. It's kind of interesting too. Like, I don't know if this is in most monarchs, but I almost forgot she had a husband until he died. And then it was really weird seeing her in the middle of the pandemic by herself, crying in the corner of his funeral by herself. Like, nobody around her, just by herself in a corner, all in black. Like, okay, like, we're just going to show the world this old lady crying. I thought that was really weird to watch. I remember being like, I'm going to watch something else. Like, I really don't want to watch an old woman crying about her husband dying.
Yeah.
And it's not like, I know that in the ceremonies and whenever the queen comes up and she sits on the throne and addresses Parliament or any of these special things that the monarch does, it's kind of weird. You don't even hear a peep out of, I guess, was he a king, or he's not technically a king? When you think of, as a kid, like, I'm the king and I'm going to marry a queen and she's my queen, like the old way. Mm-hmm. It's almost like they don't do that now.
Well,
what is there a reason for that?
I think that the times that I'm just thinking about that, because he was Prince Philip, right? We never called him King Philip.
Right.
And it doesn't automatically happen. So there were, at one time in British history, there were dueling, or not dueling monarchs. There probably are always dueling monarchs, but there were a husband and wife who were joint monarchs, William and Mary II and William III.
Were they related? Were they related?
Well, they were technically related, but in that case, it was after a troubling incident. It's just, I would love to know about the astrology of this period of time, because when William was a Dutch prince, right? This is William of Orange, who was invited to come over to replace a Catholic monarch, James II. And he was invited because he happened to be married to one of the daughters of James II, who was Protestant. So,
did you know that William the Orange is the same birthday as Charles III, who just took the crown?
Oh, that's right.
I have his chart up.
Isn't it? Is it November 5th?
It's November 14th, 1650. Okay. And he's a 22-degree Scorpio.
Really? Wow.
And so is King Charles III, who just took the throne. And no full moon, but a moon in Leo. It's kind of interesting because that you bring up this monarch, and they have the same birthday as Charles III, who just took the throne. And he was born in The Hague of the Netherlands, or it's called Du Haag, but yeah.
Den Haag. I don't.
My Dutch in me is like,
okay.
Or I don't know. My family would probably be like, correct me and like, the Haag.
Yeah, I never know how to pronounce Dutch. It's never the way I think it is, because I'll be thinking German and then it's just something else.
Yeah, it's a little different. It's a little bit more elegant.
Yeah.
But it's, because I've been really looking at Charles' chart, and I'm really interested because it's a little creepy to me, and I'm just going to say that. Did I put him under? I put him under. Where did I put him under? Did I put him under my charts? I think I did. I think I put Charles. Oh, you know what? They probably have him under the monarchs. Yeah, there we go. Charles. Yeah, here we go. So he's 22-degree Scorpio, November 14th, 1948, but he has a full moon lunar eclipse, and he's got the moon right on the queen, his mother's sun at 0 Taurus, and Biden is a Scorpio with a moon at 0 Taurus. And it feels very weird because I don't know if you saw Biden's very short, I guess you could say condolences to the monarchs, but he said that I talked to the new king and I told him, she'll always be with you. And it's like they're kind of big buddies, and they have the same astrological placement in many ways.
Charles and
Biden. And I think it's weird that they both have come in within the same period, because even though I know the Queen just passed, Charles was already taking over many of the duties and even speaking for her on the throne. Mm-hmm. Not as king, of course, but still.
Right. Except
we see both of them come in at the same time.
Yeah. You know, it's okay. So that's interesting. And then thinking about also William of Orange. And that his birthday is the same as Charles's.
Right.
Makes sense maybe why they named William, their son, right? I'm sure he was aware of that. But you asked me before we started about, what were and you asked right now this question of what were big changes that happened with monarchical shifts. And I was just sort of, well, not really very many in the present day. But William III is a perfect example, because when he and Mary came to the throne, they were invited by Parliament. This was a huge shift because James II had been Catholic and and he abdicated. But he was really forced to leave, and he fled the country, and William and Mary were invited to come over. But they were brought over and then accepted the English Bill of Rights from 1689 in order to gain the throne. So that's the first time in modern history that we have Parliament sort of setting this precedent of, yeah, it's not just divine right. You're coming over because we're inviting you. And there's a legal sense that the monarch reigns by the will of Parliament as well. And then the English Bill of Rights is where we get so many of our principles for our Constitution as well. So,
and what year was that again? That was
1689.
He was born in 1689, right, William?
Oh, no. William, when was he born? I had a list of monarchs up.
Because I have a Prince William of 1689, born in 1689 in here. Or is it the Duke? Oh, no, it's not that.
It's William III and his birthday or birth year, 1650. Yeah, William III. I wonder who was November 4th. Oh, actually, he was born November 4th, but because of the calendar difference, that's the Julian calendar, so it would be the same day as Charles. Because I always would think of it as the evening of Guy Fawkes Day.
Oh, I see. William III of Orange, right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and what was funny was we were talking about him in our last thing we did, which was earlier this year, about the Jupiter-Neptune conjunction, and how there was a similar quality to a lot of that, and also Pluto-Capricorn stuff that we were talking about at the same time. We were kind of going into some of these different subjects, but especially in 16... when did he take the throne with
Mary? 1689.
1689. That's where, let's look at that, because I'm
looking up the Secession.
Yeah, I remember that when you brought up this whole story, it blew my mind, because we were seeing similar stuff that was coming up at that time period. Oh yeah, it was Neptune and Jupiter Pisces. Yeah, so it was the following year. And they're not going to let me do that. I'm going to have to give me 1 second here. There we go. 1690. Yes, and Jupiter, and so weird. Jupiter today, exactly where it is right now as we're speaking. But in that same year, and we go backwards by month, and we get to Jupiter, Neptune. Yeah, Jupiter, Neptune, Pisces, like we're in this year, and then of course it was 1856 following this, and then now, but it was exactly the same time period, where it's almost weird how it's not the normal lineage coming in. I feel like there's a lot of that question with the President of the United States, but it's interesting also with Charles III now. There was a lot of questions whether or not it should not go to him or not.
Right.
And I think it's been interesting how they're really not bringing that up in the media.
It is interesting that, I think when he got married, when Charles, the current King Charles, got married to Diana, there were questions about whether even she was a virgin and she could get married, right? Like that was a big deal. So we've gone from that era to now, he got divorced, that's okay. I mean, I guess Henry VIII already established you can get divorced and kill wives and still become a monarch or be a monarch. But usually they don't prefer that the monarch is divorced. And I remember there always being some kind of, question about whether or not Charles would actually do it, just because also there was people who didn't feel warm and fuzzy about him after the whole Diana incident.
Well, and also his wife now was in a marriage too.
Right. Yeah.
So they both cheated on their partners.
And they have the tapes of them talking about it. So, yeah.
But it's weird because I feel like that's what's really interesting about these times. And speaking with you about monarchs throughout these last 3 years and doing the shows that we've done, it's been really weird to see people are letting the 10 days of mourning be this weird period where it's like, don't even discuss anything negative. Right? And especially as an American, like, I don't really have to do or say in some sort of alignment with it. Or nobody does in the world, really, if you think about it.
Right.
I mean, if really you believe that the monarch is just there to hold the space of keeping the energy of the country in a place of neutrality and representing the country and the elegance and actually still ruling even the money in the monetary system in many ways. I think it's just really funny that, like in America, we have freedom of speech where we can say whatever we want. And I guess that's true as well in a constitutional monarch for Britain. But I feel at the same time, there's the underlying, like, how dare you? I've been noticing a lot of that, like, how dare you? Or even in Australia, there were so many talks the second she passed of like, hey, we don't want to be part of this anymore. And anybody who did was in the media just looked at as the worst person on the planet. And you can't say that. And so I feel like that they're using this in many ways because if I remember the way that William of Orange III, there was a lot of weird propaganda in order for that to happen, to bring them in. Am I correct? Because we were covering propaganda of Jupiter, Neptune, and Pisces at the beginning of 2020.
Yeah, there was a lot of, I'm trying to remember what specifically we talked about, but
there was about there was like some agreement that they had to sign.
Right.
And then there was also to not get the other monarch in power that was supposed to be. There was some there was the propaganda that was created.
The gossip about the fact that so the issue came down to the fact that his wife had a baby. So he had children already.
A bastard child.
Yeah, and so the gossip and pamphlets came out that said actually that the baby was switched at birth.
Ooh.
That she might have had a weak baby or one that died and another one was brought in because it would call into question the bloodline. That's why, that's one of the big things that will come up.
Yeah, they didn't have blood tests back then.
Right. Yeah. And how many, actually this goes back. There are other monarchs that now they say, so when Richard III took over, illegitimately, he actually argued that it was legitimate because his the two boys that were the boy who was supposed to be ruling was actually the product of a bastard child. And but that actually a historian recently proved, that might be true by looking at baptismal records in a French church, I think. So that could actually be true, but.
Well, that's what I think is interesting, because as an astrologer, the fact that we are in a Jupiter-Neptune year in Pisces, which is the last time was 1856, and then the time prior was 1690 when we see William of Orange III come in, is the propaganda around all of it. And people might not be able to see it when you're in it. That's one interesting part of Jupiter and Neptune, especially in Pisces, is it's really easy to get subdued from what's happening and misdirected into a different area. And I'm not afraid to be the one that says it. I'm just like, there's so many questions about Charles and who he is as a person, the ethics around what he's done to his wife, who's passed, of course, or even looking at his brother and helping his brother through the Epstein stuff. And all of that is not being talked about. It's like, just keep using the Queen. I almost feel like it's Disneyland and Mickey Mouse, just kind of like, just throw Mickey on the stage again. And even when she's passed, just keep throwing Mickey videos up. Like, just keep throwing Mickey Mouse and everybody will just keep going, Disneyland, Disneyland, Disneyland. Even when, it's Goofy coming in to be crowned at Disneyland, who has some questionable ethics of what
I think Goofy would be a good king, though. So maybe Donald Duck.
I mean, I don't know. Like, I'm just saying that, like, Goofy cheated on, Donald Duck with Daffy Duck. You know what I mean? And like, there's a bunch of weird stuff. And right now everybody's like, let Goofy come up, and I think it's really interesting to see the astrology, because it brought back all the stuff we spoke about earlier this year on our special, which was that there was so much propaganda. They were literally creating the story in order to get another monarch in that wasn't blood lineage direct the way that it had been going.
Mm-hmm. Well, that is interesting. So that they were concerned. Obviously, they would have been concerned about how will people accept Charles. And so that would make sense that they would want to throw up a lot of the stories, right? But there's so much about what you just said that I wanted to talk about, like even going back to whether or not we can not speak ill of the Queen, but question things right now. Because the whole way it's been portrayed that I find interesting is it's almost that same shaming response that we've seen recently. So that obviously must be the Neptune and Pisces kind of a thing, right? That you're not even supposed to question what you're seeing.
Right.
Because so many people have accepted it. But I'm also not saying that I think that Charles shouldn't be king. And also, I think one of the things that it's helped me understand as an American who wasn't raised with the Queen and who was raised thinking that it's good that we don't have a monarch, right? That's just who I am as an American. I've seen through this, I've seen more about, I can respect, of course I would respect the Queen and the monarch, right? As a figurehead, that's a very important historical figure, and I'm a British historian and all of that. But I don't think I understood the level to which people took it personally and really felt personally connected to the monarch. And so I do understand feeling that you want to have a period of mourning and needing that space and needing time to heal and do all the things that the nation's doing. I don't resonate with it and I don't connect in the same way. And I think what we're trying to do is to see historical connections across time, and we need to have a more a distanced approach in order to look at these connections. So I hope people won't be offended if they're
I hope people aren't offended, because it's important, I think, to look at history, and especially looking at 1690 and how they didn't want the actual line to stay, and they wanted another monarch to come in to where they create propaganda and do it, that it's not like it hasn't happened before.
Right.
So to me, when I looked at the astrology of 2022, which we both did a special at the beginning of this year, we looked at, of course, the Russian-Ukraine situation. We looked at, and that was interesting because the last Jupiter, Neptune, and Pisces was Crimea and the wars in Crimea and how Britain was involved with that. And there was so much.
But also around the same time, those opium wars. That's the thing that I keep thinking, that is such a big connection to what's happening today as well. That doesn't get talked about as much, but that's more kind of what we're not talking about right now as we're focused on the Queen and we're focused on Ukraine. And we're not talking so much about what's happening in China.
Correct. And I also think that when we were also going into that, then we went into the transits that are correlating with Jupiter, Neptune, which is Uranus and Taurus, and how we were talking about the Prime Minister of Chamberlain and how interesting it was, the build-up to World War II, and how he was trying to negotiate with Hitler and the failed attempt to curtail the expansion of the Nazi regime. And then, of course, we see a major shift with the Prime Minister, which then we go into a world war with, and how interesting we saw not only a monarch change, but a prime minister change within a matter of a week. Like, it was really wild.
That was.
And so when, as an astrologer, when you look at what's ever happening in the press or the media, we also went into American history, especially during 1856, and looked at the political cartoons and the political propagandas that were during that time, and free soilers and slavery, and how you can't just look at these times without having let's just see, and having some sort of removal, because you don't want to get too caught up in the movie and believe that it's all just purely exactly what you're seeing based off the astrology.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I don't think it's trying to offend anybody or to offend anything. I just think it's an interesting historical point that when these planets align in the same space, there happens to be a lot of propaganda around, like the peak of it. And when that's the number one question happening in the world right now, is what is really real or not? And I think the number one question is, especially about this monarch shift, is we already saw Charles taking over the role for many years now, the whole pandemic. It's almost, the big question has been like, was she really gone, you know? With like how much of this really was set up for the right moment. And it just so happens to be when, I mean, even just on Sunday on 60 Minutes, and that was actually the day of the funeral, President Biden comes out and starts saying things like, yeah, we will defend Taiwan, when the whole American government, the Pentagon, are saying, no, it's the one China policy since 1979. He goes against that. And then you've just seen it ever since her funeral. The world is on fire in many ways in just the last 3 days. Whether it's economy, whether it's the UN Assembly, and now, no Cold War, and Russia saying the winds blow the other way too about nuclear war, and that we're not at war with Ukraine, we're at war with NATO, right? It's like all this stuff. How is it not planned in some sort of way, or how is it not? Or it's just the biggest coincidences of all time, which are way too big.
Or is it the divine story playing out?
That's the interesting part. But as an astrologer, and we're currently in a very rare 6-planet retrograde moment, we don't get, let's say this, if you were born with 6 planets retrograde like we are today, you're only part of it's about 5% of the population could ever be born with 6 planets retrograde. So it's a very, 95% of the time, stuff like this wouldn't be happening if you use that analogy. But it's always, to me, like setting pieces on the chessboard before the moves go. So just even if I use chess and a king and a queen, the queen, I thought of Queen Elizabeth II, she kind of moved however she wanted to on the board, like in chess. The queen can move in any direction. Right? But then the king can only move one piece or one space, right? But the king can also, castle themselves and protect themselves and uses all the other pieces, right? And I almost feel like all the other pieces are being set. It's also been interesting to see Charles really be involved with this global warming initiative and the climate change and be part of the WEF and be part of all these different initiatives as out of nowhere, especially over the last couple of years during a pandemic, like really putting himself really forward already before all this happened. So I think it's one of those things where it's like, okay, so how much of it is really going on and how much is he going to speak, I think is the question. And especially as a Scorpio, you don't know with Scorpios. There's a really good way of looking at it kind of like what's really going on. People don't tend to trust Scorpio presidents because it's one, if you look at all our presidents, we don't have a lot of Scorpio presidents, or very, very few.
Who are some of the notable ones?
Biden, and I think there's only one other. Did it just disconnect me or no? No. Here we go. John Adams, Garfield, Harding, which is weird because Garfield, Harding died in office, right? Roosevelt died in office.
Theodore Roosevelt did he didn't die in office, did he? Theodore?
No, he did not. But he did take over after Harding passed away, right after taking office. Or Harding might have been 1880. No, Garfield was 1880, and then 1900 was Harding. Yeah. Yep, he was 1920s, pass away. It was, yeah. So anyway, it's kind of interesting because there is Garfield who dies in office, Harding who dies in office, Theodore Roosevelt who dies in office. Or John Adams also being the first one to kind of come out. They always like to say that George Washington was not a Federalist or an anti-Federalist, right? They don't like to pin him, whereas John Adams is a Federalist, right? So he's like the first president to kind of call it political, because it was a constitutional battle in the convention, right? Mm-hmm. It was like the anti-Federalists and the Federalists, and John Adams came out saying, "I'm a Federalist."
Right. Interesting.
Right. So there's not a lot of trust with things, especially Theodore Roosevelt, right? Like, he was a Republican and he was, a Rough Rider, and he also was a pretty random president to go into actual battle in Cuba and be with the Rough Riders and wanted to showcase himself and rode a horse, everywhere and try to show his brute strength and his brute energy. He became president in 1901 through 1908.
But wasn't he, I was just trying to look that up, didn't he run first, or he was part of a different party? Wasn't like the Bull Moose Party or the
Yeah, something? Because like he was a Rough Rider. He was but the Republicans at the time, he wanted to take it into a different direction. He's also the first president who did have an African-American eat at the White House. I actually don't mind Theodore Roosevelt. I thought he was a pretty cool president.
But you know what's
interesting? But they removed his statue in New York at the National Museum of, forgot which museum, but yeah. I thought that was really weird. It's the one where he's standing and he's got like a Native American next to him and all that. And I was like, what? So there is some weird things about Scorpio presidents. But to me, to have a Scorpio monarch, and the fact that him and Biden are like the same moon in Taurus at 0 degrees, and the queen is 0 degree Taurus, I'm like, wait, what? It's really weird. It's really weird. And they're both Scorpios. We're coming into eclipses in Scorpio and Taurus in this next month. Mm-hmm. That it's like, I almost feel like there's this weird kind of spell, like Charles will just be just there. But I got a feeling there's going to be some. The monarch is changed, so it means that the game changes, right? Like anything could be different. The monarch could run it any other way that they possibly want.
Right, and I like your analogy to chess, right? So now there are different rules in place, right? There's a different style of moving around the board. So we'll see what he ends up doing. I mean, I know he's always been involved in environmental movements, and he's been big into preserving historical preservation and buildings and those sorts of things.
But he aligns with the political left a lot.
Yeah, and with
which I think is interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Whereas Queen Elizabeth, when she has presidents over, she actually enjoyed Trump a lot, which is kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah,
she let Trump get away with things that most, and she giggled the most with him and smiled and took him everywhere. And even when there was a lot of resistance against Trump in the UK at the time, and they were throwing up big pig,
I remember that huge balloon,
right?
The baby
and the balloons,
Trump balloon they put up.
But the Queen was having a great time.
Yeah, and she continued on with the program, as if he was any president.
Right.
She didn't treat him differently.
Right, but I also think there was I made this prediction back then that it was a lot bigger of a situation of him going there about Brexit and how trying to get the alignment of America to protect the continuity of the UK because of them separating from the EU with trade, and that includes food and all those kind of things, that it was almost like Trump was there to let's make a deal. And that's why they gave him such a big display. Like the last time we saw the Buckingham Palace be that big or anything with the monarch was literally, I guess, the Jubilee. But prior to that was Trump. And because if you think of 2019 into 2020, it was starting to get weird. And of course, a pandemic. So to see that, and then of course, Brexit happened right before the pandemic, like literally, there's a lot of interesting ways when you look at the astrology, which we've done with the Pluto and Saturn transit, which that's also the interesting part, that Henry VIII is the last Saturn, Pluto, and Capricorn monarch who separated from the Catholic Church. Also
wasn't Neptune in Pisces at that time too?
So it's one of those weird things where it's like there's a lot more going on. And there has been through all the history that we've done together through these that I blow my mind because I look at the transits and I'm like, how is this exact? And then you see the same things happening.
I wanted to ask too, so Theodore Roosevelt, when he came in, it was right after the Spanish-American War. And that was a time known for yellow journalism, right? And propaganda in the newspapers. Everything was owned by William Randolph Hearst, and there was one other big paper. And they were promoting that war like crazy and really blew it out of control, out of context of what actually happened. So that's not another time that's Neptune's in Pisces, is it?
No.
So what was going on there with the propaganda, do you think?
Well, if you think of like the Federal Reserve coming in 1913 and changing to the dollar, right, through the Federal Reserve, right, and taking control and taking away people's gold bullion, right?
Yep.
That you think of the military industrial complex and you have a president who's a Rough Rider and all about the military and starting to be like the tough president who will ride his horse still to the White House, right?
Yeah.
And creating that. You also have the Titanic and stuff like that, and the idea that there was a lot of people that were actually bankers that died on the Titanic that allowed them to move into a Federal Reserve. There's a lot that goes into the history of that. If you look up all the bankers who passed away on the Titanic, it was almost like, was that a setup to get rid of the bankers that could go against centralized banking for America.
Another
There was no
interesting
centralized
moment. Yeah.
banking. It was just the United States Treasury, right? To give it to an independent, unnamed, hidden, multiple world banks was a crazy idea that got allowed to happen.
Well, and that coincides with another monarchical change in England, when you have the end of the Edwardian era that came after the Victorian era, and George V, who comes to power in 1910. So it's around that same time that we had all of these modern issues coming to the foreground, like the sinking of the Titanic, which was a disaster unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. Right. So if you just think of it on a social level of how that kind of disaster could even be possible at that time, it was a huge shift. And it seems like also it's a shift in terms of the banking industry and finances again. So,
which with the Queen that just passed, that was the first thing that became news was you can still use your money with Queen Elizabeth on it until we get Charles on it. And the Bank of England came out and said, yeah, no, you could still use that, but we are transitioning. And then today, the Fed just came out and raised interest rates and are really, there's a lot of questions going on financially in the world right now. And it's really interesting to see the alignment again, that there is kind of a American, British monarch kind of alignments in a weird way, the weirdest way of how planets would be. But I would say that this time is the most potent of all times, where it's all coming to a head, because there's been questions about the monarch continuing or not with her death. That I have seen stories about. Like, should the monarch still be around? Yeah. Right? But then if you say that as another country like Australia that's part of that monarch, it's like not allowed. But if you're in a country like America and say it, it's fine. It's really odd to me, and that never in history before have we been able to have video and all these things to see people's reaction to it. Or to me as an American, I'll be honest, I didn't realize people really cared that much about the monarch that much. And it's a very different form of government because, they do have a legislative branch like America does. Of course, it's parliament, but they also have a judicial, and they still wear the wigs there. And they also, of course, have, like their executive, which is the prime minister. And then they have this monarch that's the fourth tier that we don't have. We don't have that fourth tier.
Right.
And we don't give money to that fourth tier either. Especially like it's really weird about the Queen. So, my ex-wife's Canadian, and I learned stories from her family about being Canadian. And then, like there basically was a tax, and I forgot what part of the 2010s. And the Queen went and bought some like $70 million diamond off the tax. And Canadians were pissed. And it just kind of blows my mind, especially they showed the amount of money the monarch has made through the pandemic, through the taxation. It's been the highest ever. And it's all to keep a Disneyland show. I feel like, but you're not allowed in. That's the weirdest part. It's like, watch Disneyland at the gates. But nobody's allowed in, and they get to live Disneyland. And then the other thing is that there's no check on the power of what the monarch does. Who's going to challenge in Canada with governor generals that represent the monarch, in Australia and Canada, or in the UK itself? Nobody can challenge a monarch. There's no and there's no checks and balances in that case to me, because they can run however they want. They can. People think, oh, they don't do anything. I'm like, well, the prime minister typically always every week goes on leaves Downing Street, goes to Buckingham Palace, meets with the king or queen every week. Who's not to say that? To me, I've always felt like monarchs found a good way of making people more subservient by making them feel like they have more power. That's what people always asked for in history, right? Was we want our own ability to have our own parliament and we can start creating things we want. And it's like, oh, okay, but I'll still have the overreach power at the end of the day to veto it.
Right.
Or make you feel special that you can open the doors to parliament to let the monarch in.
Well, that's all
show. It's all show.
Well, it's so interesting because I was just talking about Versailles and Louis XIV and absolute monarchy in one of my classes, and that was the ultimate. The king has all the power and watches everybody struggle to get next to them and does whatever the monarch wants because that's the way you can advance in society. But the thing that's interesting to me is that I think that's how a lot of us who don't have a monarch think of monarchs in general, but the English tradition and British tradition, I guess I should just say the English tradition was always that the monarch, yes, has special privileges, but also has obligations and also rules with Parliament, right? Even before the Bill of Rights. So there was always a check on, or an understanding in English tradition that the monarch is there because the powerful lords are allowing that person to be there. Like you can go back to the Magna Carta and see that there's a sense that's shared. It's not an absolute power, which and we talked about this before, when a king got too absolutist, he ended up being executed, the first King Charles. So I think that that's something to keep in mind. But at the same time, there is a sense that the monarch has a special place. There's that sense of it's a legacy. It's not just Queen Elizabeth II or King Charles III. It's this person who comes in this long line of succession that has all this ritual around it of consecrating the individual as somebody who is uniquely special. And the fact that they're coronated and consecrated by the Archbishop of the Church of England, that they're consecrated in the coronation by the Archbishop of England, is that's one of the interesting things about it too, that we don't understand because we have that separation of church and state built into our Constitution as well. So,
but this is where it's interesting to me is I'm here on Wikipedia. The monarch is also able to advise, generally done in secret, to change draft laws. The monarch also is the head of the British Armed Forces.
And the head of the church.
Right. And then, that's what's funny. They don't bring that up. And kind of interesting to have King Charles as
Charles III. Let's see what happens to him
as head of that, right?
Yeah.
And it's like there is so much done in secret, and it's of course the functions of bestowing honors and appointing the prime minister, or they're not even talking about the governor generals either.
Right.
Like there's so much that they make people feel like, no, there's not that much power there, but it's like
there's a lot of power.
There's a lot of power,
especially in terms of cultural weight and how you react to something as the monarch, or, I think Queen Elizabeth tried to be conscientious about not seeming to favor particular people and always doing her duty. But that was her thing.
In public, not in secret.
Well, we don't know what they're doing in secret, right? That's the thing. That's what's, to me, that seems like a Scorpio would enjoy that part of the job, to be able to have the secretive aspect that the public is never going to see, right? I've toured Buckingham Palace, and I didn't get to go into all the nooks and crannies. And I mean, I haven't been in the White House, but they wouldn't let us do that either. But this is just an interesting side note. When I was in Ireland, in Dublin, I did tour one of the state buildings, and I was shocked at how much access we had to all parts of it, and that there was a sense that there was a real sense in the way the tour even happened that people in Ireland have ownership over the government, and in a way, or that it exists because they all created this contract together and became a state. after they got rid of the British monarchs, right?
Right.
So what I'm surprised by is how much in America that doesn't seem to be part of our identity as it is in Ireland or even in Australia. I know we don't have as troubled of a past with the British as the Irish do, in recent times. It's far enough away that I guess we're sitting here longing for some sort of inherited power to be in place. It's really strange. Isn't it odd too that at the same time everything was becoming more about science, now we have a fascination with this divinely ordained or divinely consecrated individual. Like, do we want to have that over us? And I'm only talking about how it's so fascinating to Americans.
I agree,
right
especially because if you think that the monarch have the power over the whole entire British forces, and then they also are appointing the prime minister.
Right.
So you have to remember so much stuff is done in secret, especially with the prime minister and the monarch and the governor generals that deal with the other two prime ministers of Canada and Australia.
Right.
That right now, if you think of World War II and you think of, Chamberlain was horrible, right?
Right.
So it's like, let's find somebody tough. Let's find somebody good. And giving that power to a tough prime minister makes it almost to where it seems like it's the prime minister carrying everything along with the war, when the monarch is saying what to do and is providing the resources and the money and the say so at the end of the day. That it's almost like it reminds me in chess, like, let's use the bishop as the prime minister, like, you're the representative of it, and so I think it's interesting that is Charles going to start, saying anything to Putin? Probably not. But it's interesting how this new prime minister has come in, and we don't see her at all. She's been whitewashed by the media because, of course, it's been all about the Queen's.
I saw her walking up the aisle at the Queen's funeral. So,
right, and her speech about the Queen passing, which was her first big moment, and that's it. So we don't know. And with everything going on right now in the world, it's like they're kind of having to catch up because they've been like lost in Disneyland for a second, like big electric show on Main Street. That I think it's really interesting, but I feel that, no matter how much I've tried to tell people or I've looked at, it's not so ceremonial when it comes to oversight, especially in the legislature. There are moments where at the end of the day, the monarch can veto things. And the other part that they have is that the sovereign is personally immune from criminal prosecution or arrest, as well as from civil actions, and their property is not subject to execution or foreclosure. The crown, however, as is distinct from the sovereign, can be the subject of the proceedings for tort and contract since 1947. So it's like they really don't have any oversight over them at all.
Well, also, don't our own members of Congress have similar protections from proceedings, right?
Well, there's impeachment processes, and then there's committees, right? That intelligence committees, and they get certain secret, confidential, but they're from both sides of different parties, and they're the representatives of the people.
And we have a process in place that governs when those sorts of things happen.
Correct.
Right, and the idea is we continue checks and balances.
And you, me, or anybody else who's an American citizen and over 35 years old can run for president, and if enough people vote for us, we could be in the White House and be the executive and be the commander of the military. And there is nobody that's up there based off this own entity that's using its own family line and saying who's next and who's not, and has no oversight and has nothing and still controlling everything. And that's been going on since the beginning of the last millennium.
Now, here's something I've been wondering in recent history in our country. would it be, I'm only playing devil's advocate, I don't really believe this, but would it be a benefit, though, to have an individual in place who is supposed to be uncorruptible and is supposed to stand for these higher principles and is supposed to be a representative that's in part divinely ordained or consecrated or divinely
like a pope,
blessed, but not a pope, but a monarch, right? Because I think to myself, I think that's why people maybe are so fascinated by the idea, because it's this idea of, it's almost how we view God, right? Like one day, I remember being a kid and you get in a fight with your sibling and it's just like, one day God will know that you were wrong and I was right. It's almost like this sense of, it would be a relief to know we have our big mom or our big dad who's going to, in the end, be the fair one or be our representative or our advocate, because we see so much infighting in politics these days.
But I think that's what the founders were trying to eradicate from, was the idea that that's not possible.
Right.
And that there has to be checks and balances, and that there cannot be a monarch, and that it has to be the people themselves that have the checks and balances and the three forms of government that are equal. I mean, the fact that we are Ron Paul said it best on his leaving when he left Congress in 2012, he did 2 different speeches. And he was in since 1976 at the time. So he was in there for a long time. And he's like, the whole time I was here, I was fighting for liberty, but not a lot of people want it. And his famous part about it was that, like, people don't want liberty anymore. And people are at a place in life now where, they're just going to let this Federal Reserve just run all these banknotes and do all these things. But the main thing that he brought up in his debate in 2008, which got him popular, was that there are no declarations of war in Congress, which is what the Constitution says. The executive branch is just going into wars now.
Right.
Right? So that's what Bush did, right? That's what Biden's doing. Like the funding might be there, but when he's out saying that we're going to go defend Taiwan, right? Technically, Congress should be voting for a declaration of war against China to defend Taiwan. Right. And so when you really think about what's happened in America is, people are corruptible in all ways. So there is no one person that could ever be the judge, the jury of that. It's all these different these 3 branches, the people, the executive, which is part of the people, but it's kind of we're going to run all these federal bureaucracies. And then, of course, the Supreme Court, which is based upon fate, right, of whether they retire or pass away, that the executive branch then sends to the legislative branch to think, is that okay, and get enough votes to pass that, to get that Supreme Court justice. So really the best system is the American system. It just hasn't been used correctly for a while now.
Yeah, it's in what's in place is that we do have a great system. We've got checks and balances, and we've got liberty. The idea of liberty is very important, right?
Right.
And what's interesting to me is, how have we gotten to a point where we've kind of flipped into, so we've gone from 1689, the English Bill of Rights, starting this, and John Locke's ideas of kind of really formulating the ideas of what we're entitled to because of our own sovereign power within ourselves, right? That the individual is coming together as a society. To then, where did we get to the point where somebody in Congress is saying, yeah, Americans don't want liberty anymore because it's too much work, or I don't, and even if I say these things, like I've been in places where I've said, because there's always somebody who's worried about what's happening in America and we're all doomed. And I will always say, we aren't all doomed yet, because we have checks and balances. Just let the system work. Let's see what happens before we start to take someone's bait and go down a path of fear and worrying, and then we ignore what's happening and we abdicate our power. So to me, what's interesting is there's this long history of like a give and take of power, whether it's going to be centralized or given to the people. And it feels to me like in our country, we're at a point where
we sell our liberty away for safety.
Yeah.
And that's Benjamin Franklin's famous quote: those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety.
And are we even safe after
well,
all?
we're more unsafe.
Yeah.
The idea of the Patriot Act was sell a little bit of liberty to spy on people and get rid of habeas corpus and our Fourth Amendment rights to be spied upon, right? And we're seeing that more than ever in our social media. We're being fact-checked. We're being this. We're being that. Like the idea of that, right? So it's the idea of, and so I feel when you bring up John Locke and you bring up 1789, and we see, we're going to get the perfect monarch that's going to agree to not be so tyrannical, or actually really what it would be dictatorship, right? It's trying to get rid of a dictatorship style. That's what a monarch is. Like, I'm the supreme one and you're not, and you must listen to how I do it. So let's throw the buffer, because, as a Leo, which rules kings, and I go by the Leo king, right? That's what Leo rules. And it's interesting, you always see the lions, and you always see, right? There is the star Regulus, which was in Leo, and it left in 2012. But you see throughout all the peak periods of where Regulus was over the time period of, let's say, the last 500 years, which was in the last decan of Leo, the last 10 degrees of it, you see the problems happen when it's too much of a monarch. So it's almost like make people feel like they've got freedom, but still keep us in a good place to where, I think the monarch's got a great now. I almost feel like John Locke did a favor for the monarch and made it stronger by taking, it's not like people every day are going, what is the queen or what is the king doing? It's like, no, it's Boris Johnson, or now it's this new prime minister, or it's what you see, and especially the way that it's such an over dramatic parliament, right? Where they're yelling at each other and da-da-da-da-da.
I love that. I wish
I love it too, but it's almost Congress. Like a really good... get your sense of the monarch away, right?
Yeah.
And to where, but everybody's still paying them to have the greatest show on the planet, no oversight, do things, play with Epstein, do whatever you want,
right?
And nobody to deal with it,
As long as you're there for the state occasions.
Yeah, exactly.
And to sign the paperwork.
Which makes no sense. What a huge big tax waste of money. I mean, people have been trying to compare that, gosh, the British do it so much better than the Americans. I'm like, well, under Biden, Trump went to Mount Rushmore and had a huge July 4th. And then he even had a July 4th in Washington with the military and tanks and planes and you name the whole thing, right? Mm-hmm. Or it's just one of those things to where it's like, it depends on who's the president.
Right.
The patriotism that's shown based off the president. Like most presidents, except Biden, doesn't matter if it's Democrat or Republican, use the White House as a beautiful place to showcase America. Mm-hmm. The Biden administration has kept that place locked up unless it was the Easter Bunny that was pushing him off the second that he needed to talk. So, it's kind of a weird thing where it's like in America we have not a similar system, because in the sense that the ceremonies and so forth are really dependent on who's running the executive branch at the time. Whereas I almost feel like the people of, and you have to think of all three countries, it's not just the UK, it's also Australia and Canada that are giving their loot to, oh yeah, it's going to the monarch. And, people they don't like Justin Trudeau or they like him. There's a governor general there who's like, hey, that speaks for the monarch. That's hidden always, too.
Right.
There's a lot of hidden pieces. And they prop up and make it feel in the media. It's really unfortunate when I talk to a lot of people, especially in my age group, 38 years and younger, they think that Justin Trudeau runs Canada fully. they don't realize that he has to report to a governor general who represents the crown.
Right.
Or that the prime minister down in Australia has a governor general that has to speak to that governor general that represents the crown. There's way too much that always funnels back up to that spot.
Yeah, and it's always just there that power hasn't actually changed. The power structure has stayed the same.
Right.
It's the duties that shifted a bit, right? But the overarching structure is there still. And to me, I wonder, just on a larger, maybe metaphysical level, what does that mean when when your idea of power can still be concentrated in one body, but you say, okay, we're a constitutional monarchy and we have all these other things that will help share the power, but to have 3 branches of government written into our law, I wouldn't trade that for a representation for a queen that looks nice or a king who's a really great guy and he can be cool and whatever. But that seems to be what we always want our presidents to turn into.
Right.
And we have it, we've got those limits built in so they can only be there for 4 years. So whether we like them or not, the idea is always that the next one will come in. But it's just been so recently. The other day, Brian said, politics is like sports now. It's like people don't care about the idea of our branches of government or the transfer of power. It's just my side's going to win no matter what. And people want the spectacle of the fighting because it's more fun, it's easier. I don't know why, but really I think we're at a crisis point where we aren't driven to want to maintain our power.
Right. No, and I feel like, we were talking earlier before the show and I was, it's about succession, right? And so there's a deep understanding in the monarch of who's going to be the next one. And that's where usually there's a lot of strife within the monarchs, right? There's and even it's got as crazy as, like this cannot be the person, and every attempt to not make that person be the next monarch. And then every attempt to make sure it's this person, right? It's really intense.
Right.
So they throw up Harry and Meghan Markle, and it's like William's the next in line, technically, by blood and how it works, and then his sons. So Harry's like not even close to getting it this life. Like it's like the fact that it's just the fact that he's like what, 4th in line. So it's like you're 4th.
Maybe if there's a plague, a true plague that
correct,
just wipes
or
people
if
out.
a plane crashed and all of them were on it, like the
Right.
In and Out family, right? And the daughter got everything, and she lost her parents, and the In and Out family. That's what happened in the In and Out family, right? But it's one of those things to where it's like I feel like the spectacle of the Meghan Markle and the Harry thing takes things off William to make William be. It's like they figured it out after Longshanks at the beginning of the millennium. And now we probably shouldn't be doing the Longshank, the English original kind of way of doing things, which was with brute power, strength, and telling people how it's going to be. And especially to the Scottish and English wars were so extreme that it's like they've learned after 1,000 years how to really soften it.
Right. So
in the right way. And astrologically speaking, everything from the schism from the Catholic Church with Henry, like Henry's thought of chopping wives' heads off, right? But to me, it's like, the more I looked into that history of Henry VIII, it's like, geez, that guy did so much. Leaving the Catholic Church was the biggest thing that he did.
yeah,
and
talk about a huge shift.
most
in
people don't
history.
even think about that.
But what you're saying, David, is so unique. I've never heard this. So actually, John Locke could have been an English plant, so that they didn't have to always be fighting for their power. They could sit back and pretend like these other people are
Correct.
ruling. And they got rid of the colonies that were probably too expensive at the time after a while, and got some other colonies that were making them more money. But I'll have to think about this idea of of it being really easier. I mean, it's true that it is easier to be a monarch today than ever, because for thousands of years you had to fight as well. And I'm trying to remember who's the last monarch. I think George II, who was in the 18th century, was the last monarch to ride out into battle. Right? They don't have to do that anymore. That's not part of their expectations.
Well, and if we were to think of presidents as kind of a monarch, right? But it's not. Mm-hmm. It was interesting on George Washington's farewell address, and this is what I always go to, is he goes, interwoven as is the love of liberty with every ligament of your hearts. No recommendation of mine is necessary to fortify or confirm the attachment. The unity of government which constitutes you one people is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is the main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. But as it is easy to foresee that from different causes and from different quarters, much pains will be taken, many artifices employed, to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth, as this is the point in your political fortress against which the batteries of internal and external enemies will be most constantly and actively, through often covertly and insidiously directed. It is of the infinite moment that you should properly estimate the immense value of your national union to your collective and individual happiness, that you shouldn't cherish a cordial, habitual, and immovable attachment to it, like the monarch, accustoming yourselves to think and speak of it as the palladium of your political safety and prosperity, watching for its preservation with jealous anxiety, which I think is an interesting point, right? Like there's a lot of people who are jealous and are anxious about a free country without a monarch that runs itself by their own people. And he even goes into this when it comes to, there's in front of this is where, discontenting whatever may suggest even a suspicion that it can in any event be abandoned, and indignantly frowning upon the first downing of every attempt to alienate any portion of our country from the rest, or to enfeeble the sacred ties which now link the various parts. And he really goes into that we shouldn't ever give any we shouldn't show more love for another country outside of ourselves. We should remain fully neutral. So even showing the Queen so much in America is showing too much favor to the UK in the middle of another World War III on the brink right now, or NATO, or being part of NATO, or being any part of these things that were the downfall to liberty. Mm-hmm.
Well, so we are allowing ourselves to be distracted by the spectacle. And that's exactly what Washington said in that speech, right? That it would be by covert means that we could give up our liberty. And I mean, I'm not sure whether that's intentional by some group or not, but that's kind of
as he says, insidiously.
We're being slowly coerced, or we have been lured away from being attentive to our own liberty by allowing ourselves to be distracted by this idea of what a honorable leader would be, or what a respectful, fair, just type of leader would be. And then even then, it's like we're projecting onto leaders. And I'm not saying, I know Queen Elizabeth was probably a wonderful human being, but people also have watched things like The Crown and think and feel that they know her or know Prince Philip, and kind of project the way they feel about the characters in this show. And I'm talking about Americans, right? Who this is the way we encounter the monarch, is through our media. And a lot of people have watched that show. And it's what I see is a lot of people are really interested in the spectacle because they feel they know Elizabeth because they watched The Crown.
Right.
Right.
And that's I think what is the most ironic part of we are at the exact position with Pluto in the end of Capricorn here. That was when the Declaration of Independence was signed. And you see the fights for liberty and freedom more than ever in the last 2 years as this has arrived through the pandemic and through lockdowns and all these crazy things. And you see how it's ironic, too, that the UK becomes the first country to just like, what do you mean we locked you down? Everybody's do whatever you want now.
Right.
And how this is all kind of after that just been this huge to this moment. It's like so much has happened for them to change all of it.
Right.
Right. And then actually hold accountable, because there's one thing about the British Parliament that American doesn't do is like if you're telling everybody to lock down and then you're out partying like Boris Johnson, they hold you extremely accountable. Right. Gavin Newsom in California, nope, let's just keep voting for the guy, keep letting him go.
Yeah, and the other thing about the English situation is the press there acts like a press is supposed to in many cases. So with Boris Johnson, that was all over the media, the British media, not ours. We didn't see a lot about that here.
Right.
And we didn't see a lot about when England was dropping mandates and becoming less strict, whether it was just because of Boris Johnson or not. It was almost like they were heading in that direction, but then the expose of his parties kind of pushed
right.
it
And
more.
who's not to say, because it all is in secret.
Right.
Was it the Queen who said you need to resign? Right.
We will never know.
We'll never know.
Yeah.
Or is it Charles? Because the whole thing is, because Charles was speaking for the Queen so much, and she said a couple of words at her Jubilee, and she pushed her really weird button that did this like 3-strand DNA.
I didn't see that.
Right at the Jubilee. Like she went, and then all this like, it's the DNA strand, but then it's got the third line through the middle of it, which is really creepy.
Didn't you look at that with Dylan? Or I remember seeing somebody looking at it at some point.
Well, I looked at that and I was just like, this is creepy. But the fact is like, who knows who was, she met the newest prime minister like literally 2 days before she passed. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
And, I just feel like there's a lot of things that because we can't see behind those secret meetings.
Right.
That how much really is just set up, and the idea that the monarch just plays no power role, when I feel like that's the main chess player. Like, this is what's going to happen. You're going to go out, you're going to do it like this, and because once you become prime minister, you have to be appointed by the monarch.
Mm-hmm. And there's no guarantee in the British system, as it is, that the monarch won't try to use their influence to manipulate the system.
Correct.
Because there are many opportunities for them to meet in private or for things to not be recorded. Yes, I understand there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that happens in our system as well, and a lot of money exchanging hands and all of that, right? So our system is not infallible either. But it's just that in the nature of our system, power is decentered, just in the structure of the system. So there's always the chance that the system is going to work and expose something.
Right.
But that's not built in the British system. So if Charles does decide to get in and be more interventionist in subtle ways, there's no protection. So they could have deals and all of that. Not that I'm not saying that they do, but
well, and that's the interesting part in America, right? There's term limits.
Right.
And as I'll go back to Washington, he goes, to the efficiency and permanency of your union, a government for the whole is indispensable. No alliances, however strict, between the parts can be an adequate substitute. They must inevitably experience the infractions and interruptions which all alliances and all times have experiences. So it's really interesting because he goes into, especially talking about alliances, that everything should remain neutral. We should never commit ourselves as a country to an alliance with another country, because then that creates more enemies.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also the same thing of the alliance to the idea of a monarch, right? Like, we're just dead committed as people and our branches of government to serving a monarch. You will never have liberty with that.
Right.
And I think that's what's the interesting part of this moment in our lives, is that I know there's so much in the past, but I feel like this moment is like making the past look really, of course, of where we're at in evolution right now is extreme. It's all happening at once. There's almost 8 billion people on the planet now. It's a lot happening. There's information. It's just zooming by. But it's interesting to me to see that there is this moment where it's like Americans are forgetting why we left. And people in Britain are still caught up into what's the difference of being a redcoat, right? Loyalty, right? You had to have loyalty in that Revolutionary War. If you were a colonialist and a redcoat came to your home, it was like, do you still serve the king? Yes. Then the king's gracious for letting all of his generals take over your house. Thank you. That's why the Fourth Amendment and all these amendments to make sure that no troops can quarter in your home, that there's none of that on that other side. That if it got really crazy, the sovereign monarch, let's say let's say Parliament blew up, and let's say the Nazis back in the day when the Luftwaffe were doing the bombardments of London all the time, and they happened to get Buckingham Palace, and they got all these things, right? There's nothing to say that the monarch can't do the same thing and send out, they're in charge of the royal forces, send the royal forces out throughout the UK and be like, are you loyal to the Queen still? And King Charles III? Yes. Okay, we will love to take quarter in your home. The king is going to sleep here.
Well, but that's one of the problems with the American Revolution, why it started, right? In the 1760s, they were doing that. They were doing the Stamp Act and doing illegal things that were illegal according to the English Bill of Rights. So England does have in place laws that says the monarch can't do that because of what happened with William III.
Yeah, but nobody can, if you're in control of the royal forces,
right,
and it gets crazy,
right, well,
then
so you can, so it's not, it wouldn't be a daily thing.
That's what I'm trying to say, is that the monarch has never proven to actually follow it correctly in the history when it gets crazy, right? So it's like it's getting crazy, and you got Charles up there, and you don't know what's going to happen next, right? I mean, the Queen was pretty like easy going, but you had 9/11, and you had Tony Blair as the prime minister at that time, and you have them throw the American Star-Spangled Banner, national anthem for the first time ever in England. And you start seeing these right? And then they both go into Afghanistan and Iraq together. Mm-hmm. So you've been seeing this unification between the place that our founding fathers right now would be like, what? You're serving to the idea that it's Tony Blair, or the idea that it's Boris Johnson, or the idea that it's Theresa May, it's not, it's the monarch. That it's easy for me to see that as somebody who really appreciates the, whether I read the Federalist book, or whether I look at the Constitutional Convention, the Articles of Confederation, or I look at how, many people have never read Washington's farewell speech and his warnings, and they're all happening right now. And when I see the Queen on TV more than anything else in America, it's the exact thing he warned against. Mm-hmm. And that's where the astrology's right back at the same time. I was on the phone with my grandmother tonight, and she's gonna be 93 this next coming up. She's a Scorpio, and she's concerned about the way the country is, and she's been around since the Depression, and to see liberty fall so much. Mm-hmm. And I gave her all my positive insight that, once people's backs get to the wall, which we're right at that point, I told her, I'm like, we're right there, then it will probably change. But when you're in a system where you can't change it until you go up against it, we're the only country that in the last 246 years has ever gone up against that big of a monarch and to a war to get rid of it. I mean, if you think of Hong Kong, and that was annexed right back to China, but China paid a big bunch of money for that, and the British Empire got out of there. But then watching how they had a contract with China, and then seeing all the Hong Kong riots of 2019 and how those got stopped by a pandemic, it starts making you question on how much the monarch sets things up, and how China breaks that deal and says, no, we're going to start not letting this place be independent, right? And started to throw in their communist rulership there, not fully, right, but enough to get people to where they were being black bagged in the streets. And that's the scary part to me, is that we're at a point to where I've never seen such a Disneyland spectacle take so many people over without the remembrance of, you like to bring up the English Civil War, and that's before America, and that was the first try at liberty and freedom, and they ended up failing and asking for the monarch back after chopping off a king's head in the middle of the courtyard in front of the whole country.
Right.
And people don't seem to know how to run themselves at that time and beg for the monarch back in many ways. I mean, maybe not beg, but feel more safe.
Well,
let's give up our liberty again for safety and have a monarch again. When you didn't have one, you actually did it. So the Revolutionary War to me is like the second try at it.
Right. And I think the English Civil War is one reason why the separation of church and state was so important for our revolutionaries. Mm-hmm. Because the thing is that the monarch was displaced for all sorts of reasons, and that he was infringing on his rights and responsibilities, what he should have been doing. He wasn't doing the right thing, according to a lot of the influential people in Parliament. But what he was replaced by was Oliver Cromwell, who was a Puritan, and it was an extremely puritanical government that was in place that dictated things like, you can't play sports on Sundays. It's the holy day. It was very puritanical. It also created the idea in England of a more modern military. So where that you would have people trained and soldiers ready to go to fight in wars that would be modernized, and they would drill and be a professional army, unlike what was there before. So that could then be used to police citizens or to police, I guess they became citizens at that point, former subjects. So in many ways, what the Commonwealth was in England was like the reaction against the monarch. It was one of those situations where you get a shift, but it's like the reaction of the exact opposite. But still the fascination with somehow the ruler has to have all of the power because we can't control ourselves. We have to be told you can't play sports on Sundays, you can't go to the plays, you can't have actresses, you can't do all these things because it would be too scandalous and you wouldn't be moral people anymore. And to me, I don't know what was happening actually. I don't remember what was happening in the astrology of the 1650s. But it was the understanding of divine right, that the king had divine right. Like if it was God's given me the right to be the king, it was almost like I am fated by God to be the ruler over you. When Henry VIII made himself the head of the Church of
Right.
England. He took over that power from the Pope. So the Pope is the head of the Roman Catholic Church because the power was given. You know, the story is that the keys of Christ's kingdom made their way to Rome, and the popes are all in that legacy, right? So when you think about it, the British monarch has that power, having taken it away from the church. That's, you know, within the system, historically,
Right.
I'm saying, and historically the power of being a monarch that comes from a specially, anointed family of some sort that's been agreed to be royal, of royal blood. There's that sense of it's divinely ordained to have a particular monarch,
Right.
in many ways. But
Which, I mean, it kind of is kind of one of those weird things. Maybe it's not called divine anymore, but it's switched to science, like the way that we're seeing in all the countries, including the UK and all the Western world, this not divine, but this scientific right that is without any factual basis that to mandate, which I think is funny, that's an English term, right? Like to mandate science onto people without a choice to take it or not.
right, so
So there's a
It's
similarity coming up, which is a little scary because the Queen didn't come out, and she cares so much about human rights. She didn't come out and say anything. Right? Or in America, Biden put executive orders that all corporations must, and all employees of the government must, and all the military must. So he tried to get as much people, except for small businesses under 100 people,
right.
right? Which was 3/4 of the country must do this with divine right for himself. But it's weird using this scientific new idea as a religion.
Yeah, and it was, science has become the new religion. It's so dogmatic, that which is not scientific, right? The scientific process, which was created during some of the times that we're talking about, right, was meant to question things and until enough evidence was gathered and reviewed by peers in the community who understood what you were looking at, and everybody agreed, okay, this has been proven enough that we can accept this as a theory now, right? Not this has been decided and it is science.
Right.
And then the way it's been portrayed or pitched to people is you do these things because it's the right thing to do. I mean, it's the right thing to not play sports on Sunday,
Right.
because we all subscribe to this notion of puritanical religion, or it's the right thing to do to take a medical treatment because it has been ordained that it is the best thing for the community. So it's again that struggle of,
And it also coincides with the climate change too, right? That the science overrules any other opinion of what's happening.
or the officially ordained science.
Right. And then even with the medical stuff that happened scientifically over the last couple of years, the churches even followed the science, which is interesting because in that period of the English Civil War was a huge battle that had been going on since the 16th century and the 1500s, right? Where there started to be this split between science and religion because there used to be very much together. And that's where, you start to see those splits, and anybody who was combining both was kind of looked at as crazy, astrologers, or right, like they were still being used. I mean, 1564 John Dee was definitely doing that work, and he was Elizabeth the First, not only just astrologer but main counsel,
right.
right? So And she was the neutral one. So it makes me wonder, like, because it's so secret now.
Well, but she was only neutral in her approach to religion. I mean, she was extremely not neutral when it came to people spying, and she had a really
she was
involved spy master situation happening.
She never had a kid or got married, correct?
No, and she well, not that we know of historically. It's not been documented. I'm sure there's plenty of legends out there and theories that she does have kids, but
she went to Planned Parenthood.
Did she?
I don't know. I just think, like, I don't want a kid.
She didn't get married, and so as monarch, right, she made the choice that she would be a single monarch, and a lot of propaganda went into creating that whole system as well, which is, again, that's why I think it's similar with Elizabeth II, right? This idea of having a female monarch is a special time because it doesn't happen as much. And if they're not going to be someone named Bloody Mary, it can be a fun thing that, okay, we've got a woman on the throne, and they use their feminine persona in a way to help solidify their rule. And Elizabeth did do that. I mean, she took on the idea of being the Virgin Queen to sort of replace the Virgin Mary at a time when the Roman Catholic Church had been, kicked out of England, right? So in a way, she took that maternal role. She stood in for the maternal divine figure that replaced the Virgin Mary. And a lot of her, like her clothing choices, the processions, she would do processions through the countryside, dressed up in, as the queen, with all sorts of people attending her, and in these big parades that brought the spectacle to people. And it was the spectacle that really made people accept her and appreciate her. And I'm sure there was just as much mourning when she died as there is with Elizabeth II, but it would have been even more extensive for Elizabeth I. I mean,
but then jumping almost 100 years later to the Civil War, it's Charles who doesn't call Parliament to session or allow it to happen for like 10 years or something, right?
Yeah, he has a long period of time where the
personal rule of Charles I.
Yes. Are you
the 11 years tyranny?
His personal rule, yes. Yeah, so the way around the system for England is that, and that would have been in the minds of our founding fathers, right? That you can always have a monarch who can disrupt the system because the check on the monarch is Parliament, but the monarch calls Parliament. And the idea is that the monarch will call Parliament in Charles I's day when he needs money. But Charles I decided, actually, there's all these fees that I can collect from people, and there are all these kind of shady ways to collect money that I'm going to impose on people and get the money that I need, and I won't have to call Parliament. And so that is what ended up turning on him, right? Because he wasn't abiding by this idea of the monarch sharing power with the members of Parliament.
So when he goes on trial for treason, is that why today maybe the monarch has to where there is no oversight to ever be allowed, like because they're terrified of having their heads chopped off by the people again?
So maybe that prevented it from happening.
Yeah, like the Parliament actually does a trial for treason, and what, he shows up as if he's gonna go fight his case as king? Or is it more like he gets pulled out of the castle?
Are you talking about Charles I?
Yeah, Charles I. Yeah.
I was imagining, if that happened to Charles III today, what would happen?
I know. Well, that's myself, what you're already ahead of me. Is like going through this part of history where we have a name of a King Charles, and the first King Charles ends up getting his head chopped off.
Yeah. So King Charles I was the son of James, right? And James himself was a little too absolutist. Charles was acting absolutist, meaning he thought he had the authority in himself to be able to do what he wanted. But, you know, let's be fair to Charles I, that he was monarch at a time when the rival power of France, the king there did have that power. And if you want to, you know, lobby for position in Europe, and you can't spend on the level of the French king, and you don't have that much power, I guess that.
And you don't have a French princess to kind of wield it together. I mean, that's why Henry VIII went to the fields of cloth.
Anne Boleyn.
And Anne Boleyn.
Well, she was trained in the with the French, right?
But, you know, it did kind of patch a lot of things up for a while.
Until she was acting too French.
Exactly.
According to the king.
But that's how she got in. I mean, you know what I mean?
She knew all those French ways.
She knew all the French ways to get in, yeah.
I mean, she actually did know what she did. Well, and like, we're jumping all over the place, but Anne Boleyn.
6 planets retrograde.
It's just so. I actually love this story about Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn before anybody knew he was going to have her executed. It was a sweet love story that I don't think I said this before, but they had I think a prayer book or a book of Psalms they passed back and forth where they wrote love letters to each other or little love notes to each other. And Henry was known to be a man who women loved. He was so attentive to women because he grew up with his mother and the women in the court because he wasn't supposed to be king. He had a brother named Arthur who was supposed to be king, but he died at the age of 16, I think.
And he was bestowed to Catherine, who that's why he married Catherine of Aragon. Not Spain, but of Portugal, right?
Aragon. And it was Aragon, a region in what's now Spain.
Yeah.
So.
And then that's why he wanted an annulment, because once you get that French love and French...
Well, maybe that's it. That was it. That explains it all.
I mean, Catherine was very...
The problem with Catherine, so obviously...
I mean, it's your brother's...
It's your brother's wife.
Yeah.
And he took this wife, you know, out of a sense of duty. He had a special dispensation from the Pope to marry his brother's widow, because it wasn't something you were supposed to do.
Something Gavin Newsom would do. Gavin Newsom cheated on his wife, and you know, all this weird stuff.
But see, Gavin Newsom isn't doing it shrewdly. He's not doing it for political reasons, whatever he does. I think he doesn't think as much about politics as Henry that did. I mean, because Henry VIII was a great Renaissance monarch.
Right. And he wrestled. Yeah. And he jousted. Mm-hmm. And he was on his royal court dancing.
And he wrote music.
Yeah, and he wrote music, and he would go do horse rides in the morning, and he would... He was like a king who enjoyed his friendships on the court. He played dice with his knights and cards.
Didn't he? He was one of the king. He was the king who gave the property to your family, right?
Yeah, and knighted them too.
Yeah,
and actually played dice and cards for over a decade.
Was it Thomas Palmer? I'm trying to remember the name.
Sir Thomas Palmer, and actually the brothers too, yeah. And
Thomas Palmer ended up supporting, was one of Edward VI's biggest supporters, but in supporting Lady Jane Grey when they tried to get her on the throne.
But that's where that's weird about how, to bring this all to the beginning of right now, is how this has been a very easy transition, at least from what it looks like. Because if you think of Harry and Meghan Markle and the weird situation, and then Meghan Markle going on Oprah and saying, I'm not going to name a name, but they were concerned about the color of the kid, right? So throwing that on the Queen, right?
Or someone in the court.
But I mean, it's the Queen. It's her. She's the head of the monarch, right? So it could be her that's throwing her in on it.
Yeah. And
then now they're all around, and then her American actress cry, and all this weird stuff. Though the act, like it is as smooth, is really well Disneyland out, right? And then you have Prince Andrew, where was he? Like, you know what I mean? And he's the Epstein case and all these things that are just like not looked at, and people go into the mourning and they focus. I mean, like people like, I couldn't believe how many people like on Instagram are posting pictures of the Queen, like 5 pictures, like, I just loved her so much.
Really?
Yeah. And I was just like, wow.
I'm not seeing.
I mean, you know, like, oh yeah, I've been seeing a lot of that lately.
I mean, I see every time I open up Instagram or YouTube, there's always a video being suggested, or there's something from the news about. Usually, it's just the Queen. I don't see Meghan Markle a lot, but.
But what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of turmoil around switching monarchs in the succession and the build up to it, and holding policy or changing policy. It's kind of like, that's what's interesting. Like, what's the policy of Queen Elizabeth II? It's almost like, I don't know. Like, it wasn't like she had a very strong policy. It's not like she made a big move like Henry VIII of, we're not going to be a part of the Catholic Church anymore. We're going to have our own Church of England, right? Make sure you maintain that. Right. There's this, I guess hers would be maintain that we're not part of Europe, that we are independent. So she kept this. To me personally, Brexit was all about the Queen being like, I am not going to give to Charles and have this line be part of the EU anymore. Where unelected bureaucrats are telling what we can do and how we can trade and how we can do things.
It's very similar to why Henry wanted to leave the Roman Catholic Church. It's the same idea.
And it was the same transit.
It was the same. What to do.
It was the same transit. So it's funny that that we both have been really looking at that, because Brexit is the same transit. It's crazy.
Same transit as Henry VIII.
As Henry VIII setting up for leaving the Church of England. Now, not the exact time of Saturn-Pluto's conjunction like Brexit was, but we did the history and we were looking at it, and it was like all the motions were already being set. It took a while, especially back then, to do it. It was like, you got to get on horse and go over there, and we'll see you in 6 months.
Right.
Tell me the next part,
Yeah.
And that's what's interesting, but it was all set in motion then. And that's what I think the irony is that Queen Elizabeth II, maybe 100 or 200 years from now, will be looked at as the queen that, but again, that's what's weird, is that monarch back then, there was no parliament, truly. It was just the king's court, right? And his advisors. And
back in Henry VIII's time, there was a parliament, but there were new courts that Henry had established, and there were advisory bodies. So he did have a team of advisors, and he had courts, but there also was parliament at that time.
Well, it wasn't like parliament was. It was like it was. I don't know if it was. It's probably not the same style as it is today. Correct?
It's not the same.
It didn't have as much power.
They have power. They had power over certain.
But what about like leaving the Catholic Church and?
This is the thing about Henry VIII, was that he didn't just decide, okay, I'm leaving the church. He is one of those examples that someone like George Washington's probably probably thinking about, because you have to be shrewd enough to figure out, how am I going to get this divorce, right?
Right.
Because the church isn't going to give it to me. But if I just leave the church, I look like I'm a heretic and putting all of my people in danger. Because if, everybody at the time, including the members of parliament or people in the army or whatever, believe that the Pope is the head of a church, most of them do, that is in charge of their salvation. So if Henry VIII just decided, forget about this, I'm just divorcing this woman and doing my thing and setting up a new church, that wouldn't have gone
and
over.
the head of a lot of the military resources was the Pope, right? Because like the Pope, of course, had the power of the three-tiered tiara and like told countries basically what they can and cannot do in many aspects, including war stuff.
Yeah, and the Pope actually
he
helped
could've-
finance princes and also helped fight wars. I mean,
So if Henry left, he could say, "Hey, France,
go invade
them.
Go get England.
And I'll get a couple more countries."
Right. So there's so many reasons why that wasn't what he could do. But what he did is what Charles I didn't do when he wanted to do his own thing. Henry went through Parliament. This was a legal reformation. It had to be.
Okay, so
it
that
was
makes
made
sense.
through acts and a series of acts that said, that granted him a divorce, that then established a new succession, appointed him Church of England, and then figured out what to do with the properties that had been in England that were part of the church, because the Roman Catholic Church was the largest landholder in Europe. And
that makes sense though to me now after that book I have, The Schism and the Vindication. For the vindication for the schism of leaving the Catholic Church from the royal point of view in the book I have is the 300 plus years of history and dates of everything the papacy had done that they were keeping records of in England. So it wasn't just because Henry wanted a divorce. There was actually a lot of atrocities happening in England. And even if you think of going even farther back to the last Saturn-Pluto transit of 1284 and the Holy Wars,
right,
and seeing what happened to the Knights Templar and having them taken out, and a lot of them are English, or a lot of them turned English that were French or that were whatever, and kind of wanted to kind of find more of a safe haven in England and change names. Like I'm Paul May, originally French, that were Knights Templars and then turned English. So it's like, there's a lot of that built up, and then the Dark Ages, and there's a lot of the church being at the center of it, and it's kind of been interesting seeing that there's a similarity because of the idea in the world of absolute, not power, but like the actual term, I forgot, I was just looking it up, but is like, I just added up. It's absolute monarchy. Which is technically what the Vatican is. Vatican City is an absolute monarchy.
Is that what something your reading says, that they are?
They are an absolute monarchy. That's what the definition of it is.
Wow.
And Vatican City-State is an independent city-state and enclave surrounded by Rome, Italy, also simply as the Vatican. The state became independent from Italy in 1929 with the Lateran Treaty, and it's a distinct territory under full ownership, exclusive domination. And so I was looking at absolute monarchy, right? So you actually, if you really think about it, the church has been the ultimate absolute monarchy, and wears the bigger crown than any other king. I think it's so funny watching the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II and how they have the crown on top, but that's a small crown compared to the three-tiered tiara that you see on a pope.
Right. Well.
Or that they have their own Vatican Bank, which had scandal for the last decade, and then they said to all the churches and to even other countries, hey, bring your money here now by September 30th. So the Pope made that announcement about 3 weeks ago, and they gave this ultimatum for something. I don't know, it's kind of crazy, but it's like, get your money in here now, right? So there's something going on. But to go back to, where I feel like the leaving of the church and the Queen leaving Brexit, it's like, obviously it's not maybe talked about because of the way that the constitutional parliamentary monarch works is making the facade up of that. It's just the people that are creating all these things. So what policy do you have to carry, since you're supposed to just be ceremonial, which ironically is definitely not, when you have the EU, which is a relatively new thing that didn't exist while she became in power.
Right.
And when she left power, didn't exist for the UK anymore either. There was a lot of battle about all that too for the years prior to the pandemic. And that's what Charles has to still kind of, I think the question is did she pick him because he made an allegiance to her that he would not give up the sovereignty of the UK to the EU ever again? Yeah. Right? Because if I'm looking at all these monarchs and how that's like, maintain the Church of England, don't go back to the Catholics. And that was the fear.
Right. Because it was that fear of an outside authority having sovereignty within England or Britain, right? So they never wanted to be in a situation where an outside power could do what the church used to do, which would be have its own courts set up in the land, right?
Right.
Or whatever, demand money payments, or be able to appoint cardinals and bishops within their territory. So when Henry did his act, it was very revolutionary in completely shifting the power and making it a little less centralized, because it was coming from the overarching power of the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah, and getting rid of the taxes to be paid to the Catholic Church too. Right. Bringing it all into his own power and to his own church, and making, so it really is kind of a breaking point in the world. And that's what the Saturn Pluto Capricorn transit happens to be. 1284, 1518, which is of course Martin Luther, who brings all this up, which causes Henry to eventually go, right?
But
even though they don't probably connect that, but really it's astrologically, it's the same idea.
Yeah. And I think looking at the astrology, so I'll say this as a historian, when you think about the astrological transits and the patterns in transits that repeat that we've been looking at, it's interesting that you come to realize, okay, so what you just said, Martin Luther, that's what sent me off on this. Martin Luther, with his 95 Theses in 1517, didn't create, he might have been a spark and it might have gone somewhere, but it wasn't just him who created something, because there's always this whole network of things that's in place that enable someone's crazy act to go somewhere. So whether it's Henry's decision, I need to get a divorce, there was something in the air at that time that allowed it to go somewhere. With Parliament will agree because they
and the
see
people
this
behind
too,
and just the Commonwealth are gonna maybe be like,
right, and
because there's always a little bit of the rebel that kind of gets people excited, right? It reminds me of Robin Hood, or
think of how boring life was back then,
Right, exactly. So to see somebody do something like that and nail something to the church door is like, right? Like, whoa!
And talk about propaganda too. Is that the same transit? Because there is so much Reformation propaganda, because the printing press was new. That's why Luther's ideas spread all over the place anyway, right? The printing press is like a new invention. It's like, for us, it would be like TikTok, right? So you are printing this new thing, making fun of the Pope, and it's getting circulated everywhere before anybody can censor it. But there was a lot of censorship at this time too. I guess I should say that, the church was trying to censor books constantly. There's so many things that are the same. As I'm talking through it, there are lots of overlaps, but propaganda was huge.
I don't know if you remember when we did our special at the beginning of this year. It was interesting because we looked at the Jupiter Neptune of when Henry was in the 30s, and if I look and bring it up right now, it was Neptune in Pisces, and the Jupiter, it happened in Aries, Jupiter, Neptune in Aries, and that was in 1536, which is right around the time exactly that there was that schism. And that's what's interesting, is that it was oh yeah, and then the one that was prior was 13 years more to that, where if I go to 2015, where's Jupiter now? Yeah, I just said past, so yeah, I need to go back one. There we go. There was a Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Pisces in 24 and to 23 into 24. And I remember that was at the beginnings when we looked at the history with Henry in 1524, Henry the Eighth. I think that's when his jousting accident happens.
Right, and that's the thing that some people, and that might be an article about that some people say that's when he became more temperamental, that he had a brain injury during that accident, because he was unconscious for quite a while.
Right, and when I remember just like looking up and looking at his timeline, I know I'm using Wikipedia, but it was at that time period where Jupiter Neptune came in when he started going, how do we get out of this thing, right? Like, so 1517 is when, and 1518 is when the Saturn Pluto transit happens. And for him, right, like he goes to the field of cloth and gold in 1520, 2 years after, which is where we would be like right now, astrologically. But it's interesting that it's like
right now. Is that what
correct? Yeah, which is kind of interesting. But it's also where this is where that the careful diplomacy of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, right, who was the cardinal that was attached to the court, kind of looking after for the Pope, right? Like
he's the one who was trying
or
to
the
get
liaison, or the Governor General of today's world, had resulted in the treaty in London in 1518, aimed at unifying the kingdoms of the Western Europe in the wake of the new Ottoman threat. And it seemed that peace might be secured. Henry met the new French king. But it's around that time where, marriages and the annulment, it's 1525. And it's interesting that 1524 is what I'm looking at, where Henry grew more impatient with Catherine's inability to produce the male heir that he desired.
And that's the same. That's where we are.
That's where we are right now with Jupiter, Neptune, and Pisces. And but when we were talking about it, it's ironic that it's the events of 15, 17, and 18 to 1524 are more condensed. So 2020 through 2022 is all those years already mashed into just these two same transits. That or the World War II transits right now, or the Revolutionary War transits, that it's all in this 2-year period that they're all happening. So that's what makes this so interesting, is to pick out, because it's like, wow, that's happening, but there was more span. That's happening, but there was more span. But now it's like, that's happening, and all those transits are happening at the same time within a 2-year period. So it's a little bit odd to me, because I feel that the EU, and I've said it for a long time, since 2016, that I feel that with what's happening right now with Ukraine and Russia, it's funny that the UK is in a position right now to where they don't have to deal with any of that stuff, right? They can do what they want and need. They don't have to follow the same rhetoric right now. They do as a NATO country, but not with what's happening with the oil and gas situation as much. There is some issues, but nowhere near, right, what's happening in the EU. That one country that says, hey, Russia, I'll buy it, that breaks that, and then chaos erupts. And it kind of reminds me of the Crimea War of 1856, where it was all these countries in Europe that were all fighting, and Crimea, ironically enough, where there's all the same stuff happening in Crimea right now.
But that's also the same year, almost the same year, that Britain officially becomes has India become a British Crown colony.
Right.
And takes over from the East India Company. So it's just interesting.
we did that. So it's like wondering with these climate deals now, or these green energy deals.
Yeah.
Like, are they going to move into that now with Charles? Because it's almost like the perfect setup. Like he's all about that. So it's like, where now that they're out,
he's all about
well,
it,
now that they're out of the EU, they don't have to go through the EU to make treaties and contracts and all these different things. The same way the Catholic Church was for Henry.
Right. So it's
positioning
themselves into the best, most advantageous position.
Yeah, and
right?
I feel like, what's changed in the times of the monarch then with Henry VIII to Elizabeth II, which is ironically the same astrology, okay, is that Henry wears it like a badge of honor and owns it, whereas this idea of a constitutional monarch or parliamentary monarch is queens in the background. Get this. I mean, she comes across real sweet, and she probably has her corgis right next to her, but she's probably sitting down like, get me out of this EU now. That's why they put Boris Johnson up there. And he got it done. Right? Like Theresa May resigned. Do you think she resigned, or do you think Queen said, get her out of here? Right? Like we never saw the Queen behind closed doors of being like, get her out of here.
We saw her behind closed doors. What do you mean? She had a marmalade sandwich with Paddington Bear.
Right, but that's what I'm saying is it's so propaganda of how, she's just a corgi lady and da-da-da. She's trying to maintain power just like any other monarch. And to have the EU... the EU got mad when Brexit finally happened, and now Farage had everybody in the UK in the EU meeting fly the UK flag, and they said, no flags allowed anymore. They had just taken that law right before the pandemic, like no flags of countries allowed in here anymore. And they waved their UK flags. I don't know if you remember that, right? That's all Queenie, that like the Queen's reign, that I guarantee she would never have given it to Charles unless it was like, all right, you're free now to go do what you need, and you must never go back, and you must never support them the same way either.
And you're saying that because it's in
because of the transit, it's in the astrology, and that's the same way that Henry never went back, and the Church of England has never gone back to the Catholic Church. And it
did with Mary the First.
Right, but it was a temporary blip. Right?
I wonder what was happening when Mary came to power then. It was probably Pluto was in Aquarius at that time.
Aquarius, and that's experimenting.
Interesting.
And trying to bring unification again, but it causes an uproar.
But really, with Pluto and Capricorn, the new structure is dismantled, and then the old is dismantled, and is the new put in place when Pluto's in Capricorn also?
And we see the end of a long cycle, but Pluto and Capricorn maintains what is ethical and what is actually right, structurally divine in a way, right? And what is not, it will not allow. So what structures need to fall are the ones that need to fall, the ones that are built off weak structures in government, or stuff that really don't support the Capricornian idea of maintaining integrity, right? Like the positive version of integrity. So any system that doesn't have true integrity, like the FBI right now, look at that in America, look at the Department of Justice, look at, the list goes on and on and on. Same thing is those checks and balances have been happening in England, but that's also a different time right now for them. Theirs was, there's no more integrity of the EU, we're out. because Pluto's been in Capricorn since 2008 and the financial collapses. But it has been America and the UK who have been leading the way as far as like, yeah, we're going to do this and we're not going to do that. And we're going to do this. I just think it's funny that the takeover of NATO happened in this year, where now the Americans have the general and is the commander of the NATO forces, right? So really, is NATO all these countries, or is it really just America? And the UK has got all their armies ready to go. And that was weeks right before the Queen died. Where the warrant officer of the royal forces told everybody in the British royal forces to tell their families to prepare for war. And so it's the chess pieces being set up in a certain way, you know, and I feel like that's where it's a little funky, because this is as potent and tumultuous, but with Jupiter, Neptune, and Pisces, there is the idea of the jousting accident for Henry VIII, right? When really he's like, "Hi, get rid of Catherine." Right?
Well, yeah.
Like, you know, because I don't know. I watched that show Tudors on Showtime, and I remember when he was doing his jousting accident, and Catherine was like, "Oh my gosh," but he didn't care. He had a lot of crushes that he had up in the stands. I don't know if you remember in that show. That's how they portrayed it.
I don't think I saw that one.
Yeah, so they portrayed it like it's almost like he's embarrassed and he's kind of like, get out, like, get away from me. Like,
oh, right.
I don't really want your care and love. I want one of these hotties over there, you know?
Yeah.
Because there were other girls that he was talking to on the court before Anne Boleyn came, and then they all got jealous.
Well, it took a long time for him to get anywhere with Anne Boleyn anyway. So
yeah, she played it right. She knew how to get in.
That's how
and
she
her
ended up being
father
queen. Yeah.
was part of all that too, and wanted to become, and he became a lord. So I feel like that's what's kind of interesting. Meghan Markle to me is kind of a weird infiltration, but I don't think she's an infiltration as much as a character, like a legitimate American actress to get America to buy the British story. And to also, you would think it's very USSR, KGB. You get people in America to be like, how dare the Queen, right? Like, or somebody on the royal court dare question the color of the baby. But now everybody's like, we love the Queen and we love Charles. It's very KGB. It's very KGB. Where you play both sides. You play an opposing side. She's the opposing side. But now that the Queen's gone, she's around more. Harry's around more. Because, of course, that's his father, so Daddy's king.
I even thought that the suspicion in the Oprah interview, wasn't it that it was probably Prince Charles who had said that?
I mean, they didn't give an exact, right? That's the whole point to me, is that it's like, it's very KGB. Right? And Putin's ex-KGB.
Right.
And that's why I feel like Zelensky is possibly, and that I can't believe that I actually went on the Ukraine Ministry of Defense Twitter on Monday night live on this show, and I tweeted to them, why are you guys using propaganda that's cartoons? Like, join forces. They've got these cartoon characters that they drew out of the Ukrainian force and how strong it is. And then cartoons of how many tanks and how many Russian people have died and soldiers and tanks have been exploded. And I was like, pictures?
Nobody,
right?
That's
like,
the thing, that we don't look for pictures anymore. We might as well be looking at Renaissance propaganda. I was sitting here looking for a really good example to show, but because it's like we are more interested. There's one up there now of one of the woodcuts that's exposing some sort of corruption being burnt up in church. But we're more interested in the story and the idea of what's happening than wanting to see documented truth.
Right.
So that we even have fact checking of this, about the, you're not telling the right story. It's a very inquisition It's
Right.
sort of, that's heresy. Nope, you're not doing that. That's heresy.
Right. Which we don't get to
and-
see the fact checkers today.
No.
And they're independent, but paid for by the social media companies and paid by the social media companies to do the fact checking.
And they fact check people like, what's his name? Dr. Campbell. I can't.
John Campbell.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
They fact check the people who are creating the facts, that who are
just
doing
showing the
work,
facts from
or who have learned how to evaluate facts.
Right.
So it's like it is very much like an inquisitorial process, in that everybody knows all the stories. Everybody's heard the data. I don't know so much if we don't all hear that right now. I think they're better at censoring now. But it's not even that you hear someone saying an alternative version of a story that you didn't hear from the mainstream media. It's that you hear it, but then you just dismiss it because it doesn't conform to what you've already been told is the dogma. That's like the church censors would censor materials. Like there's a book at the Huntington Library that is, I think it's Copernicus, and it has, or maybe it's the Galileo. I should know exactly what it is, but it's saying, the view of our solar system is not what we know, what we think it is. The Earth is not the center.
Yeah, it would
right?
be Galileo before Copernicus. Yeah.
Right. So it's then crossed out by the censor from the church.
Galileo.
But just
yeah. Copernicus got the free pass.
Right. Well, he died before they printed his
Right.
work, so he made it out. But then people could take the books and give them out to other people and read them, but the church censored them. So you could actually read those books, but the church would go in and cross out the part.
Redact it like we see
But
today.
it's not even redacted like we do now.
Right.
You could read it still. The
You could
lines
read
through
it,
it. So
right.
now you just know, oh, that's the part I shouldn't believe. Or that's the part that's not true, and it's not part of
Which actually is
whatever.
a better way to psyop it, because if you block it out completely, then it makes you look more mischief. Like there's a lot of mischief going on,
Well, maybe that's what
Whereas
it
if you
takes
black
now,
it out,
seems
it's
like.
kind of one of those things like, no, like this isn't true, but you can read it if you want. Then it kind of makes people go,
If that's
oh,
the
okay, then I
case,
won't take that and I'll read it.
Yeah.
And and then that puts it in your head.
Right,
Like,
it's this idea that the people are this mass that should always be controlled, because if we know too much information, we're going to get out of control, and it's probably true. We might decide
Right.
to replace them, but
Well, and I think that's what's interesting. There was an agent that was it was a CIA agent who just leaked out the documents from January of 2022 that the UK and America have both been in on this whole thing with Ukraine and Russia to purposely get Russia to do all this stuff, to get the EU to sanction to where they knew that Russia would cut them off, to break up the EU,
interesting.
to create the power. And what's the most interesting to me is that Russia would be on this, because it would be the same astrology that's coming up here of America, the United States, Britain, and Russia. That were all the allies. The allies was the USSR with America
Right.
and with Britain. And if you look at the way that this is playing out, like sure, America's issue is overprinting of money. Britain's issue is having some money printing issues too right now. But in general consensus of food and shortages and fuel and all that stuff, it's a high cost, but you could do it. You can use the fuel. You've got it. Whereas in the EU, it's going to be like, you got wood, right? And it's making everybody starved, and it's making all the leaders now question whether they should be part of this, because the EU was built to take out the United States free market as the biggest free market, which it did, because it
Right.
created bigger. And then the EU got the UK to join to make it that big. And then the UK is like, no, we kind of want to align maybe in another way. And that's where this game of risk is getting intense. Yeah. Whereas that I feel like I was waiting as an astrologer I needed to see a big power play that's major to show me as an astrologer where the pieces are going to set. And it was the Queen's death and Charles III becoming now the successor and official, and watching just in the last 3 days as she's fully passed and they broke the staff.
Right.
Boom. The fire got lit.
Interesting.
Like the fire's lit right now more than ever. And it's in, that's where I was waiting for, because astrologically it'd be like the fire lit of like, okay, Martin Luther makes his move.
Right.
Right. Or you could look at it in the 1284 time of like, yeah, the Holy War is like, we've got control of Jerusalem, right? Like, and now we're using all of the Knights Templar to just be Disneyland tourists to bring important Catholics over to tour the Holy Land without getting killed by any of the Arabs.
Or the moment when the French king, and I don't remember his name, had the Knights Templar, a lot of them executed too, right?
Right. Yeah, and that's really the Dark Ages in 1300s, 1307, Friday the 13th.
Mm.
Right? That's when that's why it's a bad date, Friday the 13th.
Yeah.
And then it even is stated by the Vatican that, oh, that was a bad thing that happened, but, like they do the whole but, that Pope at the time, and it really was because they were not being subservient enough. Like, it's really interesting to see their answers. They'll own it, but they don't own it fully. Mm-hmm. But it did happen. Right. They did kill them. Yeah. And they stopped that order, and then the Dark Ages go into the Dark Ages. And these are the transits of the Dark Ages, which is why I'm questioning so much about this dawn of this new world order or whatever, which is really in the Dark Ages the battle of dark and light. That's like the terminology of those times. But also it's a time where information becomes very hard to get. Yeah. And that's where we're seeing it now. If you think of everybody's being on the internet, everybody's saving all their photographs, their files. You can't even anymore. I forgot what it was just recently, and I was just thinking it's like something government that I just dealt with where I'm like, wow, all the files are on the internet only. I no longer can access, like the paper files, right? Mm-hmm. It was just like, uh-oh. Like, this is where you can change history, where everybody's gone onto the system that can be rewritten. Right, Wikipedia, right. Like history, books are not being bought as much. They're all on Kindles and your Apple phone, and Barnes and Noble's hanging on by a long thread as a corporation in America, and small bookstores too are hanging on by a thread. Mm-hmm. And they're even having problems with printing enough books in certain countries because there's not enough paper and presses because there's supply chain issues. Right.
Well, and it's even, it's interesting that it's hard to even get people to go to the library anymore. Right. Right. So we have lots of books and information available to us for free. But it's been so easy just to access information instantly, right? And so nobody wants to actually go and do it. That's what I've been so amazed at is is what's happened to information literacy, where people just accept numbers told to them and they don't look at the actual data, right? They're just looking at someone's interpretation and trusting it. I learned, but see, maybe because I have a PhD in history, but even before that, like I learned in high school, you always look for the source, right? Right. And I don't know whether that's something that will last, because that's actually the same issue that sort of Martin Luther was bringing up with the church, right? That we're doing all these practices because the church has told us to do this for years and years. But let's go back and look at the evidence, at the data. That's not what it says in the Bible, right? His argument, and I'm not arguing as a Lutheran, but I'm saying that that's what he was doing, was to say, let's return to the original source, let's get a better translation, and let's figure out what it actually says, and then change what we're doing based on what we say we believe. So I guess, do you see that even though books are maybe vanishing or information is easily manipulated, it's going to come back? Just like after the Dark Ages, all that stuff from the library that had been in Alexandria, it comes back.
I think in the next decade, talking into the 2030s, it will, but it will be new information and new ways of putting it out that are not the same. And there'll be a lot of chaos with that information kind of not being a main source for a lot of people, unless you're Benjamin Franklin at that time. Right. Or somebody like that, because the world just starts changing so much and powers start changing and the people start to come and rise and they have to deal with these systems that are all failing. Just same thing happened. I mean, the continental money wasn't sound. Right. And that was the new money. So they're talking about right now this week too, that's what came out at the beginning of this week too, is that, go ahead and let's see what the new US dollar could be if we do a Fed coin, right? The US dollar digital currency. Right. So that again gets rid of paper cash to own, or the idea that you can only pay your taxes. This is what Ron Paul did in 2010 to Ben Bernanke, the Fed chair. He put him and he brought up a silver dollar, right? Like an ounce of silver. And he said, if I want to pay my taxes, I have to pay you in a Federal Reserve note. That's not how it's been in this country. He's like, well, you're allowed to have it. And he's like, yeah, but I have to then pay capital gains tax and all this stuff to get to your Federal Reserve note, right? That's where it's going to get really weird here, is that, is the U.S. government going to be able to pay its debt when the rates are being raised by the Federal Reserve? The Federal Reserve is also doing these crazy things with the banks where the banks are asking for money, and then the banks are also giving the Fed money, and these repo markets that have come up in the last 2 years that are really crazy. So like the Fed will be like, well, how much money y'all got? Okay. And then they repo market it, and then they're quantitative easing, or they're selling assets. But it gets to a point to where what happens to where the debt's so big, the interest rate's too much, to where the American government's, the interest is not paying off the interest of the debt.
Right.
And so that's where the same thing happened in the Continental Congress and their money, where the British started counterfeiting and flooding with more money, and then it was fake money, so the soldiers really weren't being paid. It wasn't worth crap. Mm-hmm. And there was British money rolling around, and that was worth more, to try and get the people to stay on the British side of things. So I think we're going to have, it's not going to be so black and white, I don't think, of like, oh yeah, we're going to this and that. I feel like it's going to be like a flood of, hey, you sure you want to be on this, or do you want to be on that, or do you want to be on this, but you need to pay in that, and you need to go through this service to pay for that, and Mm-hmm. It's going to get, where information, to answer your book question and stuff like that, is people are going to be just trying to get through. And when the Fed raises the rates, they do that to stop supply, but mainly demand, to bring inflation down. So what that means is no more liquidity in the banking market for loans, and credit card rates go up and mortgage rates go up. And so where people are like, I can't afford that. And they're going to hit the labor market by suppressing that, to where people can't work as much and people are going to lay people off. They're willing to take all those hits to get rid of inflation. And that's where, you start to get to American revolutionary status, because people start being like, whoa, the government was never supposed to even be involved in my life, ever. But if you're British, it always was.
Right.
But not American. The government's here to serve the people, not to
Yeah, well,
drain the people or take the people away, or even the income tax, which Americans never paid income tax until 1913. That the idea was, no, it was through trade. Mm-hmm. And other countries were paying for America's bills. But I feel that the war energy is what's the most interesting, and having a king. And I know that there's been queens that have, and other monarchs that have been in big wars. But if you were to think in history of the biggest wars of monarchs that they've been through, I mean, I guess World War II would be the biggest, and that was a king.
Right.
Or I guess the 100 Years' War, and that was
a lot of kings.
A lot of kings.
But I mean, I guess I'm thinking the first Elizabeth had wars with Spain, and but no global war. I mean, nothing like World War II, right? Nothing like World War I.
Right, and it's Churchill as prime minister, and they give him all the credit, and you don't hear about Queen Elizabeth II's father much, right? It's like,
no, I mean, you see that they were doing propaganda films for the war. I mean, they were out showing themselves supporting the war effort. Or Elizabeth, what did she join? Like the nurse,
she was a nurse. I forgot about that.
And her mom
in picture.
Yes, and then but I think it was her mom who opened up a hospital for soldiers who were wounded and needed rehabilitation after the war. So they. I
wonder if during the London bombings. I'm wondering during the London bombings by the Germans, if. I don't know if, there's a lot of weird stuff of where the Pope was very close with Hitler, including it just got released in the last year that he was writing tons of letters to Hitler, and Hitler was writing letters back to the Pope. The irony is, of course, that there was the horrible atrocity happening of the Holocaust to the Jews, right? And on top of that, then you also have the British, which is the monarch, which is very much run exactly like the Vatican in many ways, that is supporting the war effort. And it's almost like they were helping both sides. I'm wondering if they told Hitler, well, bomb London, but just make sure you don't hit Buckingham Palace. Right? Like, and I know that might sound crazy, but it's like the more you look at what's been coming out over all the years, and the fact that Hitler was writing letters to the Pope and the Pope was writing letters back, and the pictures of how smiley they were together.
Right.
You start to wonder, like, what really happened in that whole period, and how was Russia or USSR at one period allies just to get Poland, right, and split that up. But after that, it kind of goes like, I hate communism, Hitler does. And, it was almost like was the Vatican trying to hope that they could get rid of the USSR? And then when it didn't turn out that way and the USSR pushed back, that then it was like, okay, turn on Hitler now. Because with the concentration camps, they never went after those until the end of the war. You start looking at all this stuff, and you start looking at moments like right now, and we see atrocities like today at the UN General Assembly. Right after Putin was supposed to speak last night, he cancels his speech and puts it out for today, knowing the UN General Assembly is going to have Biden there to see his reaction. And so he announces that we're not at war with Ukraine, we're at war with NATO. They created a war against us. They're the ones talking about nuclear stuff. The winds blow the other direction. So this is a Cold War. And then Biden says, we're not doing a Cold War here, and don't do it, and blah, blah, blah. But it makes me wonder of like how much of this is set up in really weird ways, like it was in World War II. Who's really on the teams that you don't think they would? Because that's what happens whenever Uranus is in Taurus. The unpredictability of stability between unions of countries and nations, and who's allies and who is not, switches.
Right. Yeah, and it hasn't settled yet. We're not yet to the point where the Soviet Union was our ally, right? Are we there astrologically?
No. We're at right now where they are the ally of Germany and setting up the meetings between Stalin and Hitler and saying, okay, let's go into Poland together, and you get your half of Poland, which used to be yours, and I get my half, and let's do that.
Right.
And that's the start of World War II, is the invasion of Poland, which is any day here astrologically because of the timing events. We're at any moment, and when you see all this happening, it's like, and he just called up 300,000 reservists in Russia to join the Ukrainian war, pulled the troops out of Syria yesterday to go into Ukraine. Then you have the the referendums in 4 different areas of Ukraine that happen to be where all the coal mining is, the power plants, especially the big 4 nuclear plants that we've been seeing for the last month,
Right.
that are all having votes to join the Russian Federation, and 2 have already voted yes, so they're going back to Russia. And they're in the ports by Crimea and all this stuff. So Ukraine is not going the way that they said it is. And, I start looking at all this and I think of it, it's all connected to the shift of Monarch. It was the shift of Monarch that changed it because, you see Charles a lot over the last 2 years through pandemic or through the NATO stuff. He showed up for that, right? But it's like, again, he went and was like, move my pawns around. Don't worry. I'll be coming out of I'll be making a move here soon. When you see a king on a chessboard move, it's a big deal. You don't really move the king much. And so we're about to see what the king's move here is. And I feel like that's where the way that we think of the ceremonial stuff was about the queen.
Right.
Her reign's over now. His ceremonial might be completely different, or get a new prime minister, but she also said that she would push the red button for a nuclear bomb.
Right.
So, you start to look around, you start to go, if I were to pick the monarchs of the exact transit, the most exact one would be Henry VIII. He's the one who had Jupiter, Neptune, and Pisces. He's the one who had Saturn and Pluto and Capricorn. And that's what Elizabeth had now into Charles III.
Mm-hmm. And I think that we can look at it even not necessarily that it's the monarchs making all the decisions, but you still have the same power that traces its way back to Henry VIII, that is invested in the British government.
Right.
So however the decisions are made, it's the
are
same.
Swayed in a nice castle, right? I don't think that if I was a prime minister of England, that I would walk from my 10 Downing Street to Buckingham Palace. Well, I wouldn't walk. I'd probably be in a really nice car, get dropped off, say hi to the royal guards, walk in, and now with King Charles, I don't think I would sit there and be like, oh yeah, this is what we're doing. And if Charles says, no, you're going to do this, I don't know how it would feel for a prime minister to be like, no, I'm going to do this and I'm not going to listen to you, knowing that the appointing and also getting rid of a prime minister can be done by the monarch. I mean, so that's where I think the whole system's flawed. That there's no impeachment. There's no, just one person can just be like, I don't really like that you're not doing what I want you to do. So bye-bye. Especially with the anointing of it, right? Like they're now to be like, oh yeah.
Well, they still have the anointing of the monarch, right?
Right.
That he's not anointed yet. I don't think
he's not anointed yet, but also with the weird connection of Henry VIII and Charles III would be the marriage thing, right?
Henry VIII.
that Henry VIII had all these weird marriage situations, and that Charles III is in major weird marriage situation. And you can say head chopped off or car crash in a tunnel. I don't see a difference. I don't see a difference. That you know. But I the difference I do see is that I do see it more as a much more, gosh, I don't even know how to say that, but as a much more positive thing through Henry VIII of actually like, like going against powers. But at the same time, I can understand the leaving of Brexit too as leaving powers. But there's definitely for something else, whereas I feel like with Henry, it was a little bit more about his personal relationships and his own. He kind of was a little bit more self-focused at the same time, too, about it. You know, he put his own stuff into it. I don't know. I feel like we're about to go see the wildest ride ever, especially 70 years of Queen Elizabeth II, which is the longest reigning monarch, and she really didn't make waves at all. Like, she was a baby pool, you know, and or at least that's how they portrayed her.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think you're onto something, obviously, with the EU, right? That's the biggest,
and they're
and
Scorpio,
Brexit, right?
And the eclipses that are hitting it are really bad, and the sun of King Charles III sits right on the Mars-Pluto conjunction at 24 degrees of the EU's chart. And the EU is about to just get hammered. It already is being hammered, but the big final blow is hitting this fall. I don't know how it's going to be able to stay together without Germany to stay alive, reaching out and being like, turn Nord Stream Pipe 1 on. I don't care if they all yell at us. And that's the country that happens to be in the main focus, which again, add that country and you've got all the countries of World War II that are the main players. Not Japan, of course, but they're talking about Japan right now with the yen and moving the yen around, and China, which that was the first part of World War II on in the East, was Japan invading China. Now it's kind of the opposite, where China's like, we're manipulating currency and we're doing things and we're coming, and there's a lot of karma about coming back. There's a lot of this karma element of all these things that happened back then coming back now.
So what do you think is, well, here's what I'm thinking. There are all these structures that are experiencing returns of astrological transits, and so the karma might be being revisited. So for ordinary people, we can sit here and feel like we're at the mercy of all these bigger powers. But history also shows us there's always people who are underneath the surface working their own thing and doing their own thing. Like we've talked about Isaac Newton, and I know we'll probably talk about him in the future at some point.
Well, that's, when we're bringing the show every 2 weeks, and we're just covering for tonight, having an open convo.
But I'm just saying, like, there's people who are just out there and they are living in a different, almost like they're living in a different time and space, or Martin Luther even, who show up and make a change in that context that adds another element and gets the momentum going in a different direction, right? Or
1858 Abraham Lincoln House Divided speech, loses the election, comes back and wins in 1860. A lot of that interesting element with Trump losing an election with a lot of questions, Electoral Count Act of 1887 never being able to be really truly seen in its full glory of why it's there. And now on the docket of, we'll see maybe a speech from a Republican who might call that out. It's not being talked about, and might be a House Divided style speech. That's what I remember said in our presentation, that this was the year of Neptune's position of Lincoln's House Divided speech. I thought maybe Biden might do it, as he's been pronouncing that he would be the one bringing the country back, but he did the opposite. He did that we are divided by that group, the MAGA Republicans.
Which in effect divides the country.
Correct.
Right? So,
which Lincoln never did that. Lincoln never went into that party or this party or that. It was just, we need to come together, because if we are not standing together, the house will fall. We
are seeing a reversal in a lot of ways, right? I know you've said before that things would flip in some ways.
Correct.
Right?
So I think, I forgot how I talked about this with what show, but I do so many now. It's like, but what I've been seeing in it's the Republican Party was the Whig Party. Before the Whig Party was, I guess you could go to the Anti-Federalists, because really it was the Federalists that turned into the Democratic Republicans, and then it was the Democrats that came out of the Democratic Republicans, right? It's the Republicans that were the Anti-Federalists who never really had representation as a presidency ever. Then the Whig Party comes and they get Whig Party candidates, and then the Whig Party dies in the same transit we're in right now, and it turns into the Republican Party through Abraham Lincoln. Well, you have a Republican Party that has now died. Liz Cheney just got voted out of her primary. All the Republicans, a majority of them now that voted to impeach Trump, are being voted out in the primaries or resigning. And you have a MAGA, Make America Great Again party, which would be the new Republican Party. Mm-hmm. So that's following the same trend line. The trend line for the Democrats is you stay Democrat and you stay on the story, even though you see just how there was Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats that end up during this time of, I want to keep the South, I want to keep slaves. Well, we'll let you keep slaves, but we kind of want to stay as a union. So that you have like Joe Manchins who want to work together, and in the climate change bill, or the latest bill that we just had, that was the Inflation Reduction Act, he did a handshake promise to the progressives, like, I'll pass this, but in this bill for the climate change, we're going to open up doing oil pipelines in Alaska and all that stuff, and you're going to help me do the bill to do that. And then they're back facing on him. Right? Mm-hmm. So the Democrat Party will just, whether it's a Joe Manchin or a AOC, will stay Democrat. They won't shift parties. They'll keep it. And that's always been their big problem. Right? So that's where it's, I guess it's, and I don't take this because it's my own political bias, which people think. I just follow astrology, and I follow what feels right from the astrology, and what feels on the right side of morality, and what feels on the right side of all these things, and following, especially in the Constitution and human rights. That's what the Republican Party has always stood for the most, is actual human rights at the highest one. Maybe they've had some issues with social issues, but when it comes to direct human rights of the constitutional ones, like, that's what they hold the most. They've never tried to get rid of an amendment, right, or change one. Like the Democrats have tried to change the Second Amendment, right? Or the Democrats also at the same time during Reconstruction fought against the amendment that abolished slavery, right? Or the Civil Rights Act, which was in 1964, which after JFK was assassinated, which we're entering into, is Republicans who signed that one, not Democrats in the House and Senate, but it was Johnson, a Democratic president. That the trend line is not looking good for the Democrats as far as their ability to separate themselves from the way that they want their science-like religious life to be, or Martha's Vineyard life, as we've seen in the last week with 50 migrants that got kicked out, and they gave them just crispy rice, not Rice Krispies, crispy rice, some milk, and here's just some milk, here's some cereal, and here's a cup. And then, by the way, we're sending you all to a military base. You're not allowed to stay here at all, right? Like DeSantis did that to showcase to people that they really don't care about migrants, when the signs in every store say, we welcome migrants, we welcome LGBTQ, we welcome all these people. But when it actually comes to
Right.
There, no.
And then the act of doing that, it gets kind of turned by the media into, how could he have treated these people that way and sent them? And
Right.
And so we don't ever look at the issue of, are they living up to what they say they believe, right?
Correct. Or there was a bill by the Democrats last week about gay marriage to like officiate that. And they said, we'll just wait till after the election. But then you have a Republican who, again, this is where it would be like a Whig party candidate back in the day against a Republican, right? Who's trying, like Lindsey Graham, who tried to put up a bill for a national ban on abortion at 15 weeks, right? It's like, you're not part of the MAGA thing, you know? Like, you're a Republican who's been doing a lot of stupid stuff, right? So this is where the Republican Party is going through we're gonna be a new party. And it's the same astrology. And that party that changes parties wins and does the right thing in the end. The one that stays the same and has the idea of Martha's Vineyard, like, I want to keep my Democrat 89% voting for the Democratic Party way of life, where we're all millionaires and we all have our high places and we're all white and we don't want migrants here. The same way that the South was. We're all white, and if you're black, you're a slave to me, and you're my cook, or you're my this. There in Martha's Vineyard, it's like, well, none of you guys can be my cooks right now.
Right. Well,
it's the same thing.
It's so much about protecting sources of power amongst certain groups of elite people. That's kind of part of the struggle that we've seen throughout history in this transit, right? Whether it's the church as the ultimate authority, which it was in Henry VIII's day, they were the ultimate divinely endowed property holder, had every justification and privilege to be who they were. Henry VIII was like an upstart monarch on this little island trying to tell the church, nope, you can't come here and do that to our place, right?
Right.
So in a way, it's like there's this transference all the time of who has power, how are they justifying the power, and do they honestly have the qualities they say they have that is why they are justifying having that power? It becomes exposed and shifts around.
Right. And so if you go to the American thing of today and you think of the bleeding Kansas moment where power is not given to people at all, right? Like it's that whole moment where it's a slave state or a free state, and Kansas, of course, becoming a new state of the Union, a territory. Nebraska and Kansas in the Act of 1854 called for popular sovereignty. The decision about slavery would be made by popular vote of the territory settlers rather than by legislatures in Washington. And that's where we see an election that was rigged, and a bunch of people came over in the elections, and there was all these fraudulent votes that were cast, and there was fraud, and there was these extremely bloody, battles that were happening there to force people to accept slavery in a free state that wanted freedom and not to be with slavery. And it was pro-slavery factions that thereby captured many early territorial elections, often by fraud and intimidation. It's the same transit of the 2020 election. So when people question it, and this is what I've been saying for years, before I even knew any of that would come, they called them border ruffians. And then you think of this administration and how many border crossings there are, right?
Yeah.
And it's the same thing, that crossing the border of Nebraska to Kansas and voting and forcing and killing people. And then you get to where the governor of Kansas doesn't want any more blood on his hands. So he just goes with the fake election results to not cause any more problems, which is what January 6th is to me, right? Like, I don't know, it's too crazy. Let's just not question the vote anymore. And so that's where we're at, is this taking away of what the actual power is of the people that actually are wanting freedom, and they want liberty, and they don't want to have the government choose it. So they want their own sovereignty. So they want their own vote, like the republic is made. Mm-hmm. Like, this idea now is kind of crazy, right? Like, the idea, like, states to vote on their own about things and stuff. It's like everybody is just throwing everything to the wind. Like, no, the government's supposed to take care of everything. The government, like the president, the government, the president. That's not how it's built here. And that's what's scary to me, is that as an astrologer, the 2020 election has way more questions about it based upon the same astrology and the same thing. And then what came in and forcing people to do things, and forcing people to lock down, forcing people to do mandates, forcing people to do things that they didn't want to do. Right. Same thing happened in the same transits. And then when you get to 1858, you get a moment of a Lincoln who gives people hope enough to go vote in 1860 for it and change the country. So we're a little bit of time away, but at the same time, Pluto coming into Aquarius is a revolutionary moment here by March of 2023. So there is kind of a fast track system coming with these November elections, which happen to be with the lunar eclipse, that is going to rattle the world. And if you think of the 2010 election and the midterms when Obama was in, it went all red, right? And then Obama lost his ability to govern, right? And that was with Jupiter in Aries into Pisces, and Saturn in Libra in the opposition. And here we are with a new moon in Libra coming with an opposing Jupiter in Aries as it's going back in. So it might look like the Democrats are going to take it back the way the media is pushing, but no, it's the same Jupiter transit of 2010 and the Tea Party movement that did win and did get a massive amount and made it very difficult for Obama to govern. But Obama hadn't done anything yet to really, make them go into impeachment or anything like that. But Biden has. So that's where the House divided actually is going to be extremely divided. And it is going to all be at the center of the 2020 election based upon how the Civil War wasn't so much about slavery. It was, but the issues of it was about the election fraud by Democrats in a state that was a new territory to become a state that literally didn't want slavery, and Nebraskans, it's crazy. It's wild.
So again, it's trying to assert your authority over another group of people that doesn't want it. Right?
Correct. And then if you think of the 1856 Crimea War and the Ottoman, right? It was like the Ottoman Empire at that time, and all those battles that were happening. And that was when England was sending over, remember that when we were looking at all of your slides that you found that were beautiful, like how it was those big valleys and just these huge wars where it was all these different countries just slamming, that was when military equipment really started to become a big deal.
Yeah, we should maybe see some military innovations too then, right? If what I know about history is...
Well, it's funny because that's China, Iran with their drone boats now that are literally like, we think of aircraft carriers, but drone aircraft carriers, where China has drone aircraft carriers where they have a full aircraft carrier full of drones, and then they have drone swarming.
It's like a real life version of Battleship.
Correct. And then Iran has come out with major drone and drone navy, right?
Wow.
So you actually have the countries, and this is what was warned by Ron Paul. That's the same warning that was, and I'm not talking about Rand Paul, I'm talking about Ron Paul. The warnings of, we have gotten ourselves so far down the line, as George Washington said in his farewell address, that whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Iraq, especially Iran, right? Because in 2008, Mitt Romney, John McCain, they're all talking about how Iran is the greatest threat and we need to knock it out of the war and we need to stay in there because we need to be next to Iran to take them out. Right? Nobody forgets about these things.
Right.
So the scary part is when Ron Paul says on his final speech in 2012, the second that he's already saying, we're already broke and we won't admit it. So eventually the Fed's going to fall apart. We're going to be a weak country with no money. The social dynamics will be so weak because people will be so divided by all this propaganda and false things and they don't know. That's when they're going to strike. And so America's biggest threat is by giving away our safeties and our liberties for security of things that don't make sense, like the Federal Reserve is the biggest one. Then you move down that ladder and that goes into every social welfare state, all these things, which is not the American dream and not the pursuit. And there's always more wealth off liberty than not. And so that's especially it's like the idea that the 2020 election, the fact that it's still being talked about by the president of the United States today, and that's being used as a political tool to win an election, to say these people are crazy, is the same thing that President Pierce was doing in 1856, which is why they got rid of him and they put in Buchanan, who was like a Biden because Buchanan was in the government for so long. He was a Democrat. Like he would have been the Hillary Clinton, or Hillary Clinton could come through. Like that's the craziest part is if Biden passes away in this Jupiter-Saturn cycle, which is the Tippecanoe curse, which is the Jupiter-Saturn cycle, and we're in the Kennedy assassination alignment at the same time, right? With the oldest president, not the youngest, right? And a Mars is retrograding in Gemini, which it's interesting that Biden has Saturn there, that what if the continuity of government does not have Kamala Harris become president? What if she decides to not take it? What if they throw up Hillary Clinton? Which I would not be surprised.
Yeah.
So, that's where it's going to start getting weird.
But I have to say this as I'm sitting here listening to you do this. There's not another astrologer out there who knows even about Buchanan or Pierce. And you're sitting here throwing out, well, and if you know what happened with Buchanan,
he was in Europe away, and so they used that as the excuse. And it was at the Democratic convention, right? Like, imagine being Biden, which is ironic, right? Because Biden's saying he's running for a second term, but obviously he's turning 80 years old in a month, and he'll be 83 going into that election, right?
Right.
That there's no way. Okay, we all know that, right? And even no Democrat will say, "Yeah, I'm supporting Biden."
Well, I mean, when Gavin Newsom's wanting to
debate DeSantis,
and he's just assuming that Biden won't be the candidate, right?
But then Buchanan comes into the convention and the Democratic Party goes, "Sorry, Pierce, you're gone." So imagine any president, that's never happened except to Pierce, to come into a convention. You're the incumbent president. You've been in power. You have another term. Well, back then there was no term limits for president.
Right.
You can run as many times as you want, but you've only been 4 years in. You're ready for your second term. And guess what? Nobody votes for you in the convention, and they vote for Buchanan because he was in Europe during Bleeding Kansas, because they're like, you know what? Nobody's going to vote for us.
Right.
They're all on to us. They know we did election fraud. They know it. They know that we stole elections. But we're not going to say that. We're going to get somebody who was just away from it, so people just go, oh, yeah, they're not going to do that. That was just a border ruffian situation. Right? That doesn't work out because Buchanan's War Department happens to be General Robert E. Lee, and all of Robert E. Lee's main military staff are the ones that go and form the Confederation. So Buchanan sets up that.
So we're looking for who's Buchanan right now, right?
Which would, I would say, be, it's weird because it is a Biden, but I feel like there's because of the timing being more condensed, it's two people. It's like Kamala Harris isn't a good enough person in politics lengthwise to be a Buchanan. Hillary Clinton is, and you've been seeing her with her own reality show on Netflix now, all over, or Apple TV, right?
Yeah,
they're pumping her up like crazy. They just had her on talking about some crazy thing just recently. They're having her on so much that it's like, wait, what? And then in Kamala Harris's chart as a full moon in Aries at 27 degrees and a sun at 27 Libra with Pluto squaring both, but also America's Pluto squaring both her sun and moon, it almost feels like they're not going to let her become it. Which would be, this is the year where somebody who's supposed to be a president or not the president gets told no. And they put somebody else in.
Well, I can
Which
see
is
her
how
not
the
even wanting
same
to
way
do
the
it.
Monarch stuff we've been talking about is, it's all set up in very intense ways. That have we really left? I think we've left the monarch in America, but have we left the ways the monarch runs the idea of who should be up and who shouldn't, but through more of a party system and their conventions? And like, think of Biden during the Democratic convention, and there was a lot of questions because it was like, this guy was not winning, right? Like, he was not doing well.
Yeah.
And then he went to Nevada, and Nevada pulled out a bunch of votes for him to get him back into the whole thing. Like, he didn't win Iowa. He didn't win Iowa's always the check. Biden did not win Iowa.
Well, I thought there was an issue with him. Did he have an aneurysm or a stroke or something? I thought there was an issue, or he lost his son. That was it, right? He was like a front runner, then his other son died.
Oh, Bo? I think Bo died prior during the presidency or the vice presidency.
So but I remember at some point, wasn't there a story that
it was about Hunter Biden?
He probably won't run because so it was.
It was the big questions that about the Burisma deals and all that, and that he had a big ABC interview and all that stuff, and was trying to defend all that and acted like it was no big deal.
And then they realized, nobody cares anyway.
Well, because at the end of the day, if you think of a Buchanan, it would be like, because he was part of the departments of prior Democratic presidencies on the staff, on the executive branch. So he's like a long timer, right? So it's like Biden was perfect for anybody who loved Obama, right? You're going to get direct vice president of Obama. So everybody's like, well, it'll just be like Obama. Great. And that's the idea of Buchanan. So really Buchanan is the Biden.
Okay.
While at the same time, Pierce is in many ways the weird situation of maybe Trump. Even though they're the same party, there is this weird thing of like it doubly impeached while not even president, or being president during a bunch of like crazy skirmishes between states and riots and BLM and all these crazy things, right? And then kind of like you're not allowed to do anything, and like you can't be anything. And he's, Pierce is rated near the bottom. He's at like the worse than Trump, worse than Biden. Like Pierce is near the bottom of like presidents that were bad. So and Pierce, right after becoming elected, his wife and child were on a train, and in a train crash died.
And what year was that again?
For Pierce, that was right after. So like Pierce wasn't really the greatest president and didn't go through a lot of great things, which is kind of crazy. Like President Pierce, and then like I think like wife. It was a kid died or something like that. It's like a train crash or something. Sun train, yes. President Franklin Pierce train wreck. In 1853, Pierce, his wife, and his 11-year-old son traveled by train. And they, here we could put this up real quick. This was President Pierce too, which is interesting, his look. And he was the 14th president. He won the 1852 presidential election and perhaps best remembered for supporting the Kansas Bratchet Act, which angered Northerners and heightened pre-Civil War tensions by repealing the Missouri Compromise. But before Pierce left the White House, the president-elect was hit with a personal disaster on a chilly January 6th. Ooh, isn't that weird?
Wow.
1853. Pierce, his wife, and his 11-year-old son, Benny, traveled by train from Andover back home to Concord, New Hampshire. The family, having been in Massachusetts for a funeral, boarded the two-car locomotive at around 1 p.m. But minutes after settling into their seats, tragedy struck. One of the train's axles suddenly fractured, and Pierce's car tumbled off the tracks and down a 20-foot embankment. The train car, according to the New York Times account of the wreck, broke in pieces like a cigar box. The accident resulted in several injuries and one fatality, his 11-year-old Benny Pierce, son, who was decapitated and killed instantly. So, and it took a steep emotional toll on Pierce, and he was convicted in God. So he went, and then that's where losing to future, like, would fail to win his party's nomination for the 1856 election, losing to future President James Buchanan. And then James Pierce died of tuberculosis in 1863, and right when the Civil War was ending. And Franklin Pierce, who turned to heavy drinking at the end of his life, contracted
cirrhosis.
Yeah.
Died in 1869. It's interesting that it's a train wreck, because I think, isn't that the same year as the big train wreck?
The big train wreck was 1856. Literally the Great Train Wreck of 1856. There was a lot of train wrecks.
So it's like a lot of new technology for the time that people don't quite understand yet, or
like the Max 30, yeah. the Boeing Max 737s, and those have been landed, and they say they fixed. Or in China, one of those Boeing planes, remember, blew up, and then they finally found the black box and said that it was the pilot. They said that jolted up, crazy. Or how many there's been so many plane wrecks in the last year and a half. It's like the highest in so long, especially with private planes. Or how many stories have you seen in 2022 of passengers having to take over the plane because the pilots are passing out?
I haven't seen any.
Oh, there's been a lot, yeah.
Wow.
And on mainstream media and news. It's kind of interesting. It's been planes. Or the train issues that we've had with the unions and the strikes that would have stopped the country. So it's funny that these are stories that are they're real, but people don't believe them. And then if you give them the astrology, it's the exact same astrology. Like, I don't want to. No.
Well, nobody ever believes at the time it's happening. They never see it. That's what you learn from history. Is
that's a good. That gives me hope.
Everybody always thinks at the time, we're doing this differently, or we would never do that, or we're so much more advanced than those people, or we finally understand how everything is in the world. I mean, nobody has ever. Do you ever hear anyone sitting there going, what would be an example? Like, I'm really not sure what our solar system is really like. I'm not really even sure what the universe is like. Everybody always knows. We've seen it.
When I was in the Navy and President Bush said mission accomplished on one of our big aircraft carriers and said that we're done. That wasn't what happened. It turned out to be a long war that just ended last year horribly by Biden. So, that's a good example of, like, in the moment, we've done it.
Right.
But no, or even 9/11 and the questions around 9/11. Like, why did WTC 7 fall like the others, but it didn't get hit? And that had all the IRS documents that were all paper as they were moving to computer because of the 2000, freak out, the Y2K. And they were ready to move the whole system to computers finally because they had fixed the Y2K problems. But all of the tax documents of all the highest income earners in Wall Street and presidents and all that stuff in the IRS building of WT7 at the World Trade Center go up in flames. So, you know, like there's a lot of things that we are really at this moment where all those things and everything, even from the times of the Catholic Church to Henry VIII, I would say it's, if we take 1517 to now, compressing to see how all of that has all been interconnected to this moment that we're about to see what's going to happen. And this monarch secession and change is the activating point. Because it's and Brexit was the move that Queen Elizabeth II, let's just say that she was the monarch of that moment, if you want to use the correct way to look at it, happened to be the trigger point for that. Because if you think about that, that's when the pandemic hit right after that. Like literally, within a month and a half. Like, right? You got out right on time, didn't you? You know? Right. So there's way many more cards that are preset on a house of cards that Pluto and Capricorn is, maybe all the cards don't fall, but definitely 80 to 90% of the top layer of cards in the house of cards fall. And that what's left is the foundation of the stuff that's foundationary that we need that stays together.
Right.
But that's the big question about the monarch. Like in America, the issue is not, are we going to lose our government? The government is not the institution as much as it is the people. It is the government of the people.
Yeah.
So it's not a structure. It's an understanding of people and how to govern ourselves correctly and follow a guideline about human rights and the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I mean, it's pretty basic.
Right.
There's not a lot of rules and laws. And the states are allowed to make their own laws. That's it. It's gotten way too overloaded. So if anything, America's just going to take off the whole load of regulations and all these things and federal bureaucracies and just go, because we can't afford them. That's what I see in the future. But other countries are going to be having the dealing with the monarch. And do we keep giving money to these people and they just keep just being showmen and showwomen and Disneyland characters? And do we really know how to run ourselves since we're still using money with the Queen on it? Now Charles III soon. And that's three countries that are, if you think of the amount of, the British Empire is huge still. You got a whole continent. Australia, you have the biggest part of North America, Canada. And then this little island.
Right. And if you just think of their influence everywhere, they still, for such a little island, have so much influence around the world.
Yeah, and that's why they won't have to worry about energy or gas. They've got Canada for oil, right? They've got all the resources they need. Just has, like, America is lucky that it has all the resources, and Alaska, right? That those are the two countries, and China and Russia, that this is all coming to the head point. And that's the weird thing is the Ukraine thing is Ukraine reminds me of, like, I guess if it was World War II, is it might sound kind of funny, but it kind of reminds me of what country was it that they first walked into? No problem. The Nazis. They walked into.
Is it Czechoslovakia?
No. Where Hitler was from. He was born in
Austria.
Austria, and they just rolled over and picked up a Nazi flag. That I feel like the Austrian moment has already happened. Think about it. They're already going and waving Russian flags and saying, yes, we want to be part of Russia. But the media is reporting different.
Right. So we're not out of the woods
So Poland's
yet,
next.
for sure.
And actually, Putin's already threatened Poland in saying that. If the NATO and you all do stuff and moving stuff through Poland or start moving things through the straits, because the most traffic of all the boats right now are not to America, not from China. It's all through the straits that go in through by Ukraine and all those countries around that area. That's where the most movement is of goods and stuff going on, and military equipment and all this money. And that's why I've been warning people in Poland. I'd get out of Poland fast. And they did find a vampire there.
I was thinking, ever since I saw that you showed me that story, I've seen Poland in the news, or not in the news because I don't really look at news, but in my feeds of what I look at for news, Poland comes up all the time.
Well, have you seen that there's no energy there either, and food and heating, and they're all in lines for days, sleeping in their vehicles and sleeping on the streets, waiting in lines to get resources for energy and food? That looks a lot like 1938 into 39 Poland.
Oh, or even 1930s America.
Right. Early 1930s, yeah. But, and that's America's thing, is America's coming into depression energy again, which is why we go to war.
Right. Or maybe we do it differently.
Well,
Maybe
we're doing what Roosevelt did, which was Roosevelt did the Lend and Lease Act, which was, let's give a bunch of money and lend it to the USSR. Which we're doing now. Ukraine, USSR, same thing. Mm-hmm. Right? Here's a bunch of money. Here's a bunch of our old stuff, and then doing that to the British. Here's our old ships. Here's our old prop planes, while we are building in secret with our $800 and $900 billion, act every year for the military, right? Been building the whole time and giving Ukraine our crap. Oh, you guys need some rocket launchers? You guys got those one from the 80s back there during Reagan when the Iran-Contra day? You guys got those in those? Yeah, okay, yeah, we got those. Right?
Yeah.
That's the same history is playing out. I'm like, right? The Lend and Lease Act.
Well, maybe it has to continue until we grasp the power back ourselves or do some. I mean, I don't know. We do tend to follow a lot, and we're consuming the news and we're going along with things. And people will always say that I'm being too optimistic and, whatever that. But I am a Libra, so I'm always looking for what's the way to undercut the system?
To not be part of it. When they do a draft, if everybody doesn't do the draft, or like the lockdowns, if everybody doesn't do the lockdowns, what happens? Or if everybody doesn't follow what they say to do, like our founding fathers.
Exactly. But that would be insurrection, so...
Well, technically, would it, if it's going against all of your Bill of Rights and it's going against...
Yeah, no.
Right? That the executive branch has no right to tell you what to do. Technically.
Right.
It's state laws that you have to follow. Right? So when you listen to the executive branch and you follow it, and then especially you during 2021, as you know, you've been here with me through that whole thing, and I was telling people, just wait. Forget your job. The courts are going to say no when it gets to the Supreme Court. The federal courts are going to say no, it's unconstitutional. Why would you even play with the idea? And look what happened.
Right.
So, and I lost a lot of subscribers because of saying that, but I don't care because it was true. That you have to be courageous enough to speak truth or common sense, as Thomas Paine did in 1776 in his book, that changed. He was the Martin Luther, was Thomas Paine. And I think he doesn't get enough credit anymore, because the founding fathers literally took the design of the Republic too from Thomas Paine. Right? Right. It was like, oh, thanks, man. And you got 300,000, copies sold in the first month. Like, wow, that's huge for now. Imagine back then.
Right. Yeah.
That it's common sense and it's not being afraid and knowing that the systems are so out of control and I feel bad for the police departments now. I got pulled over a couple weeks ago and he was super cool.
Can't imagine why.
My tint
okay.
on the front windshield. And he saw my sticker on the back. The sticker I rock on everything. And he was like, yeah, no worries. And then he watched my girlfriend while I went into Walgreens to make sure she was okay.
Well, that was...
Because they deal with a lot of people who don't like the police, but they know the people who like the police. Profiling by race or anything like that. I put stickers to tell people what side I'm on. That I'm on the side of the Constitution, of freedom, of liberty. And that's what the police are on. They're here to serve and protect us from tyrants from the government. More so than people think. That's the interesting part. If they're they are here to protect and serve based off the Constitution and the city and state laws in which they represent. But if you're going against the constitutional rights, which are here to protect you against state rights that are illegal, that's the only part of federalism that's good. That's the check and balance. There's a weird check and balance, and that's what the monarch doesn't have, or parliament. Constitutional parliamentary monarchs don't have those checks and balances locally.
And that's the power that we do have. So whatever our people's core beliefs and values, put your stickers on whatever you're driving, right? Because then you find your people. Right. And as I learned from your horoscope today, I think it was, this is the time when people are important and relationships are important, right?
Yeah. I mean, think of back in 1776, the flags, don't tread on me.
Right.
Right? Like all these flags that were used for the revolution and know, okay, if I walk over here, I'm on the right area of freedom. Same thing goes if you saw a rebel flag and you were totally not about slavery, you would run out. Right. I don't care if Scarlett O'Hara is trying to make me her husband. I don't want to go down. Yeah, she's too much trouble anyway. But I don't care if I think that the South is nice. It's immoral. Right. That's going to be the...
And that's the thing. It's knowing how to stay in touch with how you feel about things and how you feel about what is moral or ethical or just what you feel is right. It's constantly people are constantly trying to get us to not be in touch with that.
No.
Right? They're trying to do that foggy Neptunian thing so we will think what their values are our values. So that's the spell that needs to be broken, right?
Yeah, and that's a good way to end this is our next episode we're going to be doing is about Isaac Newton and how he incorporated science, alchemy, religion, philosophy, all the things that we have at our beautiful availability in our life to integrate, to come up with, he's like the last Renaissance man, and his actual theories aren't theories. His actual findings are used to get rockets to space today. Right. So the solutions are when you are open-minded enough to take all the information opposed to just being like, no, this is the only one that I can use. So when you see papers in the medical that just follow the same thing, no, that's not the way to go. Right. Unless that's integrated with, let's look at the data from insurance companies. Let's look at the data from, the CDC and the UK and what happened over here and what happened. You have to be able to, in this time, to see through it. You just don't pray that you can drive your car with the snow on the windshield. You have to be able to pull your hand out and do this, throw the wiper on, get a hot cup of water, before you're going to be able to see through and be like, oh, I almost went off the cliff.
Right.
Like you just...
And you don't just sit there going, the GPS, what the automatic GPS thing will get me
My
there.
Tesla automatic driver will figure this out for me. My auto mode. No, it won't. You know? That's autopilot right now is not the way to run it because it's off. Even our GPS systems have to be adjusted because of the pole shifts that are happening right now on the planet, to where the satellites have to keep adjusting, and that's why you'll be on your iPhone and it'll say you're on the street over.
Yeah, that's
have you noticed that?
Lately.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's because the pole shifting's happening, and they have to keep recalibrating the GPS systems by satellites. So we're in a world where there is no stability through. This is for sure the only way. It's much more about learning how to, especially why I love you so much and being in my life as a friend and being on High Vibe and sharing so much of the history knowledge, is to be able to, man, you always throw some new curveball in my life of something to think about.
And you're always throwing a curveball for me to think about history in a new way. So it's...
but they've both been intertwined so much, or even in Isaac Newton's case.
Well, even for the kings, I was saying before this all started too, that in a lot of cases, I don't know when it stopped, but the coronation dates were always established based on
the astrology. And they were using the anointment is the anointment of oils, spiritual oils.
Yeah, I
right?
looked that up earlier and I was going to show it, but I lost the page.
Behind me right here is an anointment kit for a true king.
Yeah.
And people don't realize, but inside of there, you've seen it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got gold. It's got 20 different oils in there.
And those things are divinely, like it's a divine tradition.
It's a tradition that you can't be anointed without the anointment. And that even goes into, even Jesus was anointed using oils too by the 3 wise men on his feet.
Yeah, and think about what he did, turned around, and I think that they anointed feet for when he washed the disciples' feet.
Right.
So that shows you right there how
Correct.
a person who supposedly has the power is supposed to act.
The wise men were astrologers.
Exactly.
I mean, so, you know.
Yeah.
But that's what's going to be interesting doing Isaac Newton is all using all of it and the last of it and all the interesting parts of the people who came before him, who unfortunately weren't able to bring it all without looking over their back all the time.
Right.
Or the people who just went one way, science way, who, I don't know if it's revolutionary enough, right?
Yeah, but a lot more people were like Isaac Newton than we think, but they didn't come right out and tell everybody.
Right.
But neither did he. It's like we know all that. This is for another show, but we know all that because of documents found after his death.
See, and that's what I can't wait to see from you.
Yeah.
Because I don't know any of that. But what it reminds me of is this moment is how many people are in the hush, hush, like, yeah, this is how I feel.
Exactly.
Right. And that's how you know we're in a period that's crazy, but we're in a period where that's your positive answer you're looking for, is when we're in those spaces, we do come out the right direction. Because the God doesn't bring us down here to have to be in that space. God will find a way to get rid of the energies that cause people to live in a world of fear and have to live in a world that wasn't made to be so. I have to hush, hush, and I have to be quiet about the information that I'm talking about or saying. And when you're seeing Dr. Drew getting canceled, I know it's such a random person that I bring up, but I just think it's Dr. Drew. Like, you know, like to watch Dr. Drew, like, being a true questioner.
Mm-hmm. That's why everybody liked him, and now he's being canceled. Huh?
And now, they've blocked many of the videos. Then he got it right back because he brought on Dr. Malone a couple weeks ago.
Oh, I missed that. I knew there was something going on, and I never investigated.
Yeah. Right.
So.
Oh yeah. So yeah, it's interesting when you start seeing people start to take the courage to. If enough people just had the courage, courage is not some crazy thing that, you know, you need to get on a horse and you need to be Henry VIII and joust.
Right. or you need to have your rising in Leo. Or
right. We all have courage to be able to, it's just a little bit. Maybe if we all just find whatever that is that makes us feel satisfied within ourselves, to feel like we're doing the best thing for humanity and for what's right, for the true understanding of human rights and the true understanding of our divine rights. And that more of us all feel the same way. We all are not racist. We are all not, we all want everybody to be happy. That's what right. I think probably out of the 8 billion people, 7.99999999999 billion are all on that page.
Exactly.
And there's just a very, very small amount that aren't.
Yeah.
And that's, I'm sure we could go sit down with people in Calcutta right now. And talk about something and break bread over something.
Yeah.
And that's where we're in a world where we're all more similar and all feeling more the same. And even the people who we think aren't are.
And the weirder the people at the top get, the more we realize how much we have in common, right?
Yeah, and I think that you can't get mad at people for how they vote, especially in a republic or in a constitutional monarchy, because that's their choice, right?
Yeah.
And so whether it goes your way or not, you can't be mad at a person. You do much better in life by being friends with a person. I think we saw too much cancellation of friendships and families over their politics or whatever over the last couple of years. And that doesn't solve the problems.
Right, cutting off people's heads never solves the problem.
No, or being a border ruffian. That's what it turns into.
Yeah.
Right? So, well, it was great to have you on, Anne. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
I really enjoyed this a lot. I needed this in my life.
Well,
and I think a lot of the 400 plus people that are in here right now did too, and the people that will be watching this. And we are bringing this show back to, we've always done this show, but we're going to be doing it more constant every 2 weeks. So I'm excited.
Yeah, it'll be very fun. I can't wait.
All right. And make sure that you join us on High Vibe TV. Truly appreciate it. And we'll see you all in the next History in the Stars.
Bye.